What is the darkest thing that Luke Skywalker has ever done? This is a question that most people don't often consider, but in Legends continuity, Luke is seen as a bastion of hope and courage. He is the champion of the Force, a symbol of what one can accomplish when they fully devote themselves to the path of the light. Using the Jedi teachings given to him by Obi-Wan and Yoda, he is almost always unfaltering in his convictions, and yet, he still is very human. Despite being what some would consider the pinnacle of what a Jedi could achieve, even Luke Skywalker has his limits, and the day when his beloved wife was taken from him, that is when his limit was reached. In today's Holocron, we are going to discuss the moment that Luke temporarily laid down his badge as a Jedi and gave wholly himself over to pure vengeance, an act which may just be Luke Skywalker's darkest deed, and the darkest moment from the Grandmaster in all of the lore. But before we open our Holocron, our mystics have foreseen even more dark deeds on the horizon. Many who are watching today have not yet subscribed. If you enjoy hearing about lesser known moments in the lore and want to hear more analysis on them, then be sure to force crush that subscribe button. But now, Acolytes, let us begin. The setup of this moment is the death of Mara Jade Skywalker. In the Legacy of the Force, which takes place in 40 ABY, Mara Jade would die by the hand of Jacen Solo. Jacen, who had recently been manipulated by the Dark Lady Lumiya and was becoming Darth Kaitis. As a brief recap, Lumiya has been a thorn in Luke Skywalker's side for decades at this point. Originally, she had been an assassin to the Emperor, trained by Lord Vader. She had then gone undercover in the Rebel Alliance and had earned everyone's trust with the singular goal to get close, kill, or, if she couldn't kill him, ostracize Luke Skywalker. She had even gained Luke's trust and become one of his close friends. But during a mission where the two of them had stolen TIE fighters, they were in the midst of a battle, and the Force alerted Luke to imminent danger. Acting on instinct, he would end up shooting down Lumiya's TIE. She survived this crash, but was horrifically scarred and disabled from it, requiring cybernetics that would save her life, making her very similar to her master Vader. But upon her return, she had trained in the ways of the Sith using holocrons and fashioned herself a light whip. At first, Luke did not truly believe that Lumiya was of the dark side. He had known her as a friend of the rebellion and of himself, and refused to accept that that had all been a lie. Time and time again, he attempted to reason with her and offered her mercy, hoping that there was some good left within her, and that she was not a Dark Lady of the Sith. But she revealed that Luke Skywalker had caused her more pain than anyone else in the entire galaxy, and because of that, it was now her life's mission to bring Luke that same level of pain, and with that pain, a promise to end his life. All of this comes to a conclusion when she exercises her master plan, corrupts Luke's nephew to the dark side, resulting in the death of Mara Jade. The Jedi Grandmaster was inconsolable in this moment. He would feel all the reasons why the Jedi had forbidden marriage and attachment in the past. During her funeral, Luke was despondent, and his grief overwhelmed him. All evidence pointed to Lumiya being the murderer of his beloved wife. And so, without fully thinking it through, the Grandmaster went after her. We'll go ahead and skip to their final meeting, which happened on the world of Terraphon. Before heading out, Luke was aware that he was not in a proper state of mind to run and govern the Jedi Order, and so he temporarily surrendered his position as leader of the Council to Corran Horn. The Council all knew that this would be a trap, and the rest of the Council offered to go with him or even in Luke's stead, but he wasn't hearing any of it. So he took a stealth ex-Jedi starfighter and went to face down Lumiya himself. In orbit above Terraphon, Luke's mind was scarily clear. He was resolute in what he had decided to do, and he planned on murdering Lumiya right then and there. As he sat, his mind would not come to grips that Mara Jade was truly gone. In fact, he refused to even miss her until he got closure and defeated the person responsible. As he sat there waiting, he thought about how Mara used to say he bent over backwards to see the good in people. But then Luke had responded, "I won't be trying too hard today." In fact, not at all. His thoughts had already turned dark, and he was no longer acting in character of the Grandmaster, something that grief often does to people. But for Luke, who was supposed to be the Paladin of the Light, this was terrifying. He then spotted Lumiya's ship waiting for him above the world. As she told him over the comm that she saw no point in running, it was time for them to finish this. For the briefest of moments, Luke considered firing a killing shot. He had perfect targeting clarity. It would be easy, but Luke refused. He remembered how she had survived her injuries before and returned as a cybernetic monster. No, this time, she would die for good. Luke needed to watch her die. he needed to do it himself. When her ship turned around and went toward the planet, he followed her closely. Lumiya then accelerated her ship to the maximum speed of its sublight thrusters, straight towards the planet in what felt like a crash dive. Noticing this, Luke said this: "Oh no, Lumiya, you don't get away with a suicide run. You're mine." The bloodthirst was now fully present with Luke, and he would use his ship's tractor beam to force the ship to slow down, to pull Lumiya away from the world. Taking the hint, Lumiya decelerated. The two warriors would finally land on one of the sky-high plateaus of the world, and finally exit their ship and face one another. Luke held only his lightsaber in his two hands, and Lumiya would draw her light whip for the very last time. From this point forward, we'll be reading directly from the book and add our own annotations when necessary. This is how the moment goes. He knew the light whip by now. He'd relied on the Shoto as an extra weapon in the past to counter the whip's twin elements of matter and energy, but he was flooded with a new confidence that he could take her with just the lightsaber that he had always had, the one that had always stood between him and darkness. Holding it in two hands over his head, he rotated it slowly, stalking around her. This is a fascinating stance for Luke. Holding the saber two-handed over his hand and slowly rotating it is the aggressive style opening stance of Form 5 Xi'an. This is the exact same stance and movement that Anakin used against Dooku on Geonosis. It's almost as if he's channeling his own father's rage in this moment, mirroring the days when Anakin began his own journey with the dark side. But let's continue. Lumiya raised her arm to flick the whip and to get the momentum for the forward stroke, and then she cracked it, sending forks of dark energy crackling into the ground at his feet, making him jump back before he sprung forward again and brought the lightsaber around in a right-to-left arc that she parried with the whip's handle. He leapt out of range, and the whirling tails again and again. Then she paused, and he edged closer again. "You hate me that much?" he asked. "I don't hate you at all. You killed her. You killed Mara. Nothing personal." She looked as if she was smiling, but the movement was around her eyes, rather her cybernetic mouth. "Just doing what I swore an oath to the Emperor I would always do, to serve the dark side. Oaths matter, Luke. They are all that you're left with in the end." She then drew back her arm and brought the light whip crackling through the air, missing Luke by centimeters. He lunged at her again and again, driven back each time. She'd slow sooner or later though, but so would he. Then, as he began to raise her arm again, he ran at her, so close that she couldn't see the whip traveling at its maximum lethal speed. He forced her back, step by step, as she tried to maintain the distance that she needed. 1, 2, 3, 4, she blocked him, handle held this way, then that, using the whip like a short lightsaber to deflect him. But Luke did not pause. He did not shift direction to wrong foot her. He drove her like a battering ram towards the edge of the mesa, pushing her within meters, then a step of the edge. This is a scary moment for the Grandmaster. He is actually unleashing real emotion. He doesn't use fanciful footwork or feints to try to throw her off. He's not using the collected and measured way of a Jedi, approaching combat the way that he always has. This is different. He is advancing forward, giving himself over to Form 5, bulldozing his opponent. He's described as a battering ram, charging her down, disregarding her own attempts to parry. This is Luke fighting like Anakin, driving his momentum forward, refusing to be diverted off of course by anything less than brute force. And because of Lumiya's weapon, brute force is not something afforded to her. But this moment is even more worrying because of just how many values Luke is compromising. When teaching in his Jedi Praxium, Luke essentially built his new Jedi code off of the teachings of Yoda. One of the biggest teachings being, a Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never for attack. This is a sentiment that Luke echoes time and time again when teaching all of his students, telling them to use restraint, temperance in battle. But all of that is gone. Right now he's not fighting like a Jedi, he's fighting as a widower. But this is what Lumiya wants. She desires for Luke to be driven towards aggression, to the dark side. It's why she's taking credit for killing Mara Jade. But this is how their duel concludes. Lumiya held the whip handle in both hands like a staff, and blocked his downward sweep. For a moment they were locked in a stalemate, pushing against each other, grunting with effort, with only the sounds of exertion, because now they had nothing left to say to each other. Her rear foot began to slide backwards as she struggled for purchase. The edge of the mesa was cracked and fissured, The smooth glittering stone began to now crumble. Luke reached out though, and caught her hand as she fell, whip tumbling and bouncing down the steep rock face into deep, dark oblivion. The Jedi then leaned back, and all his weight put on his knees, knuckles clenched white with the strain of holding her weight. And for a second, he wanted to see her face dwindling as she fell to her death, her mouth open in a scream. But that wasn't the way that he would end this. "I'd never let you fall," Luke said, and pulled her back to safety. As she straightened up, he looked into her eyes, calmly, eerily calm, and swung his lightsaber in a single decapitating arc. Now, he could finally breathe again. For just a moment it appears as though Luke has pulled himself back from the dark side, that he remembers the ways of forgiveness, serenity. But it is calmness that is not in the way of Jedi compassion now. It is resolute intention. He would not allow her to go down in a blazing fall from his own ship's cannons. He would not allow her to impact the planet's surface at full speed of her own doing. He would not even allow her to fall an unknown number of stories into a bottomless chasm. Luke had to do it himself. He had to look into her eyes, feel the tangibility of his lightsaber being driven through metal, flesh, and bone. He needed to know that she was dead, and he had to do it himself. The scene uncomfortably reminds me of Luke's vision on Dagobah when he decapitates Lord Vader. In this situation, Luke waited. He saved her twice just so that he could cold-heartedly execute her. And the worst part about it all was, she was innocent of the crime. She was a dark lady of the Sith that needed to die, perhaps, but in the way that Luke did it was very un-Jedi-like, compromising to everything the Grandmaster stood for. It would only be after he ended her life that Luke would realize what he had done. He felt through the Force that Lumiya had somehow gotten the better of him, that Lumiya had achieved what she wanted, and it wouldn't take long for the Grandmaster to realize that Jason was always the true culprit. When this dawned on him, Luke was put into even more distress. He realized that he had completely failed as a Jedi. He had acted out of vengeance, out of despair. And from that point forward, he washed his hands of the entire situation. He vowed that he would never fight Jason directly, nor would he be the one to kill him in the end. Luke no longer trusted himself to take care of the situation, and so he had a heart-to-heart with Jaina, telling her that she had to be the one to kill Jason. This event is an absolutely chilling one. At some point, Grandmaster Luke crossed a threshold in power where losing control was simply out of the question for him. By this point, it would be the equivalent, or worse than Yoda losing control. His power was so great that if it were ever turned towards darkness or evil, there would be nothing that could stop him. We covered this scenario recently in a video a while ago, where we discussed that a Dark Grandmaster is the worst nightmare any Sith could face. Jason would later get merely a taste of Luke's unrestrained power and find himself shaking in his cape. As humble as Luke Skywalker was, he is aware of the extent of his power, and is very realistic about how he needs to approach his own emotions because of it. With this being the darkest deed he ever committed as the Grand Master, it taught Luke much about attachment, how truly dangerous it was when one was in grief, and when that grief was unchecked. It made him feel like his father. From defeating a resurrected Emperor Palpatine to triumphing over the evil deity of Chaos Abeloth, Grandmaster Luke Skywalker has proven himself to be the heir to the Chosen One. Wielding mind-boggling power in the Force, he is shown to be capable of some truly insane feats. His Force lightning was potent enough to one-shot a Yuzhong Vong warrior with lightsaber-resistant skin. He once casually knocked over an AT-AT with his mind, and even walked across lava, to name just a few of his most wild accomplishments. But while we've gone over many of these feats in the past, naming as many as we could, today we decided to pay a different kind of respect to Master Skywalker. With everything the Grandmaster has accomplished strength-wise, we couldn't help but wonder what ranked as his most dominating feats in the lore. So that's exactly what we're going to discuss in today's video. Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. Today we're going to take a look at 3 of Luke Skywalker's most overpowered and unknown moments that most wouldn't typically pull from in the lore. There are of course so many feats to talk about that 3 is simply not enough, but we wanted to take our time analyzing each of these feats in particular and explain and explore exactly what makes them so impressive. So if you enjoy this type of deep dive, then comment down below what other moments you would like to see explored, as we would love to explore a part 2 of Grandmaster Luke's greatest feats. But before we dive in, we don't have the far-reaching sight of the Grandmaster, but we have felt some disturbances rippling through the Force. Some of you who are watching today are not yet subscribed. Every day we're analyzing lore both old and new within these holocron uploads, and we would be remiss if any one of you should miss out on it. So summon the depths of your own power and force crush that subscribe button to become an acolyte today. Now, let us begin. During his life, Luke had become a literal beacon in the Force, one able to vanquish and compete with Abeloth. Luke has literally come back from being briefly becoming one with the Force before, learning its truest, most natural way. This is a massive feat, but today, we wanted to look at the lore and watch where he tipped the scales so unfairly in his favor that all witnesses were left in a state of awe. These are instances where Luke was facing lesser enemies that didn't understand the full breadth of his power, and so he chose to enlighten them. The first, and one of our favorites, is from the Dark Nest trilogy, the Swarm War. This was a historical moment where Luke Skywalker truly accepted his role as the Grandmaster, and shows the galaxy what he's actually capable of. The beginning to all of this is the Jedi are at war with the Killik hive mind. The Killiks are being manipulated by a hidden influence known as the Gorog, also known as the Dark Nest. The Dark Nest is revealed to be one of Luke's own Jedi, Raynar Thol, who has joined the hive mind and is now a part of this leadership. But by joining with the Killiks, he became more than a normal Jedi. The Killiks were also Force sensitive in some capacity, with a few of them being trained, and of course, if one of them was trained, then that knowledge was transferred to all of them, belonging to the larger hive mind. Raynar was actually able to tap into the Force potential of the entire Killik colony combined into one entity, making him a truly dangerous force. With the Killiks now attempting to wipe out the Chiss ascendancy, Luke ended up joining forces with Thrawn's old Imperial command in order to put an end to the war, a war that now threatened the entire galaxy. At the climax, the Killiks are swarming the planet of Tanoop, and Luke leads the Jedi Order into a final confrontation. Fighting is erupting everywhere, where it appears as though the Jedi are going to be completely overrun by the Killiks. But Luke goes off by himself to strike at the very heart of their operation, to cut off Gorog at the head, and hopefully bring back his wayward student. On his way to the nest, groups of Killiks attempted to block his path, but Luke negligently unleashes a force blast of energy that immediately puts them all down in a single wave. Within the hive mind, he faces down Raynar, who approaches with a couple of Killik bodyguards. Luke is then described as a blur of motion, nimbly moving between blaster bolts and taking apart the enemies as if they were all standing still. He finishes the pair of bodyguards by force pushing them into a wall so hard that their thoraxes completely burst. Still overconfident from drawing upon the full potential of the entire colony though, Raynar ignites his lightsaber and engages the Grandmaster in a fierce duel. But let's just say that he thought it was going to be fierce. The duel in reality was brief. Luke simply moves out of the way of Raynar's first attacks and sweeps him off of his feet, dismembering his forearm directly to disarm him of his lightsaber. Raynar, though, still empowered by the colony, is able to ignore the pain of losing an arm and attempts to unleash a wave of Force energy to send Luke flying down the corridor. But this is what the novel says. But this time, Luke was ready. He placed his own hand in front of Raynar's and rooted himself in the heart of the Force. And when he did that, he became the very essence of the immovable object. Nothing could dislodge him, not one of Lando's asteroid tuggers, not one of Megador's 16 ion engines, not the black hole at the center of the galaxy itself. Raynar continued to struggle, trying to hurl Luke down the corridor, trying to move him a single centimeter. Luke did not budge, and finally, Raynar stopped struggling, meeting his eyes with a stunned and an anguished gaze. Luke immediately picks Raynar up by the throat and slams him into the wall, pinning him there using Force telepathy and using his mind to draw out the Killik hive mind meld. It's not long after this that Luke meets up with Lomi Plo, the Night Sister who's responsible for creating the Gorog Dark Nest in the first place at that time, and was dueling her one-handed with her two-bladed assault. And yet, when the time came for her to leap at him with a killing strike, Luke said that her aggression had made her extremely predictable. Remaining cool and calm, Luke makes two distinct motions with his lightsaber here. Between the moment she reached him in the air and the moment she was able to strike, Luke cut her into 4 pieces. Her bits landed at his feet, and he took a moment to pity her, unimpressed by her utterly, and shocked that she had been the one to start this entire mess. While Luke's battle accolades are of course something that we marvel at, what I found to be most impressive was his showcase of immovability. Luke Skywalker rooted himself in the heart of the Force. He became the very essence of an immovable object. Using sheer Force power alone, Luke could not be budged no matter how much exertion Raynar put. But this is not the first or the last time he used Force immovability, as it becomes a tool that he has a surprising number of uses with. And while I don't think that immovability is a Luke exclusive, he certainly is the one Jedi that gets the most use out of it. For our next pick, we wanted to go with one of Luke's feats that I feel is a bit underrated. At one point in time, he would use a massive Force illusion to cloak the Vagabond, which was a ship measuring 1,500 meters long. That is only about 100 meters short of an Imperial Star Destroyer. Using battle meditation, Luke made the entire vessel completely vanish from sight. To understand this, we have to understand the complexities of what Luke pulled off here. Force illusion usually falls under the umbrella of affect mind, which means that one desires to cast an illusion, there has to be a target to perceive it. Basically meaning, one isn't simply making a vision appear out of thin air, but affecting the perceptions of specific individuals around them. The ability of force projection is also a different kind of illusion, as it's projecting a visual onto another location. What Luke did was essentially combine these two principles to create a similar effect, using the Force as a cloaking device. When he did this, there was a specific target that he was trying to trick. Rather though, he was attempting to establish a cloak over the ship in order to remain in place for a temporary period of time. Essentially, using the Force to bend the light waves around the entire vessel so that it completely vanished to the physical eye. This would be an insane feat if done on oneself, or even with a group of people. But when Luke did it, when he was on this ship, it was just shy of the size of a Star Destroyer. And even after doing it, not only was he not tired, but Luke was disappointed with the result. Luke believed that his touch was too heavy-handed, and he still had room to improve. If you want to think about it this way, this feat is technically equivalent to Starkiller having pulled down a Star Destroyer from the sky. While Luke didn't exhibit a destructive power, he still held a 1,500 meter long ship totally under his influence, and totally under the influence of the Force, so the principle is the same. Not to mention while Starkiller had to exert every bit of his power to execute just a raw shoving of power, and to bring down a ship, Luke exercised an extremely intricate and a complex ability of the same scale, but with ease. Luke even critiqued himself after the fact. But if you still desire to see Luke telekinetically take control of a massively impressive object, then look no further than the Yuuzhan Vong War. In the war, when he manipulated a tiny, artificial black hole. A Vong ship had something known as the Doven Bastles, which would manipulate gravity for defense purposes. They were shown to be capable of creating black holes that could move entire moons. But we'll just go ahead and read from the novel. Luke sank back into the chair, and he closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, and reached out through the Force. He let his sense of things ride above the frayed one's jagged profile, and vectored in towards the vehicle. He got no solid sense of it directly, though a few frayed ones did appear to be housed inside. Instead, he used that emptiness as a way to point to search out a void, and as it formed, the black hole blossomed fully in the Force. The void that the vehicle's Doven Bastles created to intercept the missiles, this was a gravitic anomaly that had substance in the real world. Tiny threads of the Force leaked into it as insects and birds, bats, and bugs were pulled in. Luke would use their vanishing life traces, the very currents in the air that the void created, to define the void. He traced its edges, knew exactly where it was, and knew how powerful it was. He opened himself to the Force more fully than he had in years. He sought more power than he had when freeing his nephew. The Force flooded into him, at once molten metal hot, yet as soothing as a cool rain. It swirled through him, filling every cell of his body, freeing him from fatigue, sharpening his mind. Luke reached out with that power, and latched onto the void that the Yuuzhan Vong vehicle had created. He pushed a bit, then tugged. In nanoseconds, getting a feel for the power of the Bastles, they were able to exert control over this void. Luke almost smiled, since that amount of power was nothing compared to the Force. But he stopped himself short of pride in that fact. Immediately, the Doven Bastles started to shift, and the void began to cover for a new attack vector. Luke fed the Force into the hold on the void, thwarting them. Their pressure increased though, and Luke still held it unmoving. The torpedoes got closer and closer. The Bastles pulled harder, and with their effort reached a new peak. Luke let the void slip over towards intercepting the proton torpedoes. The Doven Bastles devoted their efforts to sliding the void back into place, which required both the same lateral movement and shortening the arc over the void that it would travel. As they brought it close to the vehicle, Luke pushed with the Force. Since the Dovan vassals were already tugging the Void back towards the vehicle, they were not prepared to have the travel accelerated. The Void crashed into the vehicle, striking it in mid-spine. The long vehicle bent backwards as both ends became sucked into the black hole. It flowed like thick liquid, all the sharp horns, all the bony plates becoming fluid as they curved up over the Void's event horizon. In less than an eye blink, the vehicle had been consumed by the Void, leaving a huge gap in the Yuzhong Vong formation. In this instance, Luke is not simply moving the black hole, but actively wrestling for control over it against an opposing force. But that opposing influence was so inferior to Luke that Luke actually held himself back from smiling when he opened himself up to the Force, drawing upon its power and exerting himself to a point that he hadn't in years according to his own admission. This gives you a pretty good idea of how powerful Luke really is. This was a casual affair. Grandmaster Luke treats artificial black holes as if they were an obstacle, and then can turn them into weapons for his own cause if he wants. When we released our breakdown of Darth Sidious's lightsaber form, one of the most common responses we received was, if Sidious is so difficult to classify, what about Luke Skywalker? And that question is completely valid, because Luke, much like the Emperor, is one of the hardest duelists in Star Wars to pin down when it comes to the 7 classical forms. Luke's lightsaber style refuses to sit still. Across his entire life, it evolves, reshapes itself, and adapts to enemies he faces and the lessons that he learns. And because of that constant evolution, fans have debated his preferred form for decades. For this holocron, it is not about declaring Luke the greatest duelist of all time. That conversation is coming later in the GOAT series, and Luke's argument is incredibly strong, maybe the strongest of them all. But today's video is something different. Today we are performing a technical analysis of Luke Skywalker's lightsaber forms, his preferred techniques, the foundations he relied on, and the evolution of his style across his life in Star Wars Legends. We're going to examine how Luke was shaped by his enemies, how his combat philosophy changed as he matured, and how his raw power allowed him to take the forms farther than anyone else in the Jedi Order. And while Luke eventually becomes so fluid that he blends and transcends the boundaries of all of the named forms, there is a clear foundation to Luke's technique. One lightsaber form that follows him through every stage of his journey. In this video, we will break down each form that Luke used, when he used it, how it evolved, and ultimately reveal the core style at the heart of Luke Skywalker's lightsaber mastery. This is not the GOAT debate. This is the technical breakdown. Now, let's begin. Luke Skywalker's journey as a duelist begins in the most humble way imaginable. On the floor of the Millennium Falcon, with a training remote, a blast shield, and Obi-Wan Kenobi giving him the most basic instruction on lightsaber combat. It's important to understand exactly what Obi-Wan is teaching here. This is Shi-Cho Form 1, the oldest, simplest, and the broadest of the 7 lightsaber forms. Shi-Cho isn't about elegance or precision, it's about the fundamentals. Footwork, balance, body mechanics, the wide sweeping strikes that every Jedi learns before anything else. These are the philosophies that create a foundation for all future training. Luke's movements during this period reflect this perfectly. His strikes are heavy but unrefined. His defense is instinctive rather than strategic. He's learning the rhythm of the blade, the pace of a duel, and the basic idea of letting the Force guide his actions. But this foundation comes with a massive limitation. Luke never receives the classical Jedi training that every other knight once had. He doesn't train for years in the temple. He doesn't go through the discipline of the Padawan saber trials and drills. He doesn't have rotating masters or formalized lightsaber lessons. Luke Skywalker's training is a few minutes of Shi-Cho with Obi-Wan Kenobi, a handful of defensive drills with Yoda on Dagobah, because we did know that they did train with the lightsaber, although very basically. Yoda was never intending to train Luke with the lightsaber during this section of his training. This was about Luke refining his connection to the Force, learning the light from the dark, and learning to turn away from the darkness and embrace the light in the darkest period that the galaxy had seen in centuries. Yoda does not give Luke formalized lightsaber combat training on Dagobah, because he simply believes that it's currently beyond his skill set. And Vader certainly is. Not to mention, Yoda had bigger worries about Luke than teaching him how to wield a lightsaber. He believed that that would naturally flow later. But then Luke is thrown directly into one of the most difficult duels in galactic history. No other Jedi has a steeper learning curve than Luke Skywalker. No other Jedi had to adapt so quickly with so little to draw on. This is where the first major theme of Luke's style appears, the theme that defines his journey as a lightsaber duelist entirely.
Luke is shaped by the enemies that he faces. Because Luke never had a formal apprenticeship, he learns the same way a survivor must learn, from necessity, from limitations, from imitation, from instinct, and from the smallest glimpses of the Force trying to guide him. What Luke Skywalker doesn't realize entering Cloud City is that every Jedi form that he knows, the very little that he's received from Obi-Wan and Yoda, is not enough. He is walking into a duel with someone who has fought and mastered lightsaber combat for over 4 decades. But here's where Luke's true lightsaber technique will begin to take shape. But not because he chooses it, but because he must. Because the moment Luke ignites his blade against Darth Vader, he is forced to abandon everything he learned on the Falcon and on Dagobah, and to adapt to something far more advanced. When Luke steps into the carbon freezing chamber on Bespin, he is not a trained duelist, he is not a Jedi Knight, he is not even minimally prepared. He has received less formal training than any Jedi Padawan that ever walked the halls of the temple. But Luke is something far more dangerous. He is a Skywalker with raw potential who learns at an impossible rate. And in this duel, Luke's fighting style undergoes its first true evolution. Luke is forced to learn from the only teacher that he has, Vader. Luke's Shicho fundamentals collapse within seconds. Vader effortlessly disarms his structure, overwhelms his footing, and redirects every wide attack that Luke desperately throws. No amount of basic training could prepare him for Vader's precision, his power, and his decades of mastery. But Vader makes one mistake, one that will define Luke forever. Vader doesn't kill him. He tests him, he probes him, he teaches him. Intentionally, Vader becomes Luke's first real instructor in advanced lightsaber combat. Luke is not trained how to fight like a Jedi, he's trained how to fight from a Sith. Luke watches Vader's stance. He watches how Vader absorbs blows instead of dodging them. He watches how Vader turns defense into overwhelming offense. He watches how Vader applies pressure by dominating the pace of a duel. Luke begins to mirror these patterns, first subconsciously, then intentionally, and in doing so, Luke steps into the first real form that he will ever use, Form 5, Jem-So. Luke's Jem-So in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi is not refined. It is instinctual, it's reactive, it's emotional. Luke copies the philosophy of Form 5 before he learns the technique. He absorbs Vader's lessons by necessity, not by instruction. But what he does have is something that Vader recognizes instantly. He has strength, far more than any novice should have. Luke uses heavy force-augmented blows, explosive forward pressure, instinctive power attacks, rapid counterstrikes, and attempts to dominate the bind the same way that Vader taught. There is a reason Vader compliments him, and Vader means it. Luke has picked up the core principle of Jem-So, turn the opponent's attack into your advantage, then respond with overwhelming force. But Luke is incomplete here. He has the heart of the form, but not the discipline. He has the strength of the form, but not the mastery. This is why in Return of the Jedi, Luke's power comes from emotion and momentum. He presses Vader with devastating two-handed blows. He channels aggression into dominance. He bulldozes through guard and defense with Skywalker velocity. But his technique is still in its infancy. Luke's duel in Return of the Jedi is not a work of a refined master. It is the work of someone with terrifying potential. Someone whose power gives a glimpse at what he will one day become. This was never about elegance. It's about instinct, adaptation, and about survival. And this is why this stage of Luke's journey as a duelist is so important. Luke uses Jem-So because Vader forces him to. Because his body, his power, and his lineage make him perfect for it. It becomes his foundation. It becomes the spine of his technique. And it will follow him for the rest of his life. But Vader is not the last enemy who will shape Luke's evolution. Another opponent, one far stranger and more unorthodox, will teach him the next major component of his style. Before we examine how Luke continued to evolve his combat style though, we need to define the very form that became the backbone of his entire philosophy. Because to understand Luke, you have to understand what Jem-So is. It's not a technique, but a way of engaging with the galaxy. Jem-So, the form of power, resolution, and necessary dominion. Jem-So is built on one central principle: turn defense into control and turn that control into victory. You achieve this through overwhelming power. Carry a big stick and speak softly. Where Sarisu waits, Jem-So responds. Where Form 7 loses itself in the storm, Jem-So channels emotion into counterstrikes. Where Shicho is broad and instinctive, Jem-So is focused and intentional. It is a form defined by blade binds and leverage, strength and momentum, controlled aggression, overwhelming counters, and ending the conflict before it spreads. Gemso is not chaotic, but it is not passive. It is the form of a Jedi who must act. This is why Gemso resonates so deeply with Luke Skywalker. Luke is a Jedi who must not stand idly by. He has no choice. Luke is not a political Jedi. He is not a bureaucrat. He does not wait for committees, councils, or senatorial permission. Luke is a Jedi who follows the Force even if it makes him unpopular, even when it pushes him at odds with the galaxy around him. He steps in front of the danger. He stops threats before they multiply. He chooses to protect rather than negotiate when time has run out. Luke does not hesitate when the Force tells him that a being must die for the safety of the galaxy. Not out of hate, not out of anger, but out of clarity. This is why Gemso fits Luke in a way that fits almost no one else. Gemso demands decisive intuition, confidence in the Force, emotional control, compassion balanced with strength, and the willingness to act when others will not. It is the perfect form for a Jedi who must resolve conflicts before they grow catastrophic. A Jedi who carries the responsibility of the entire galaxy. And that is who Luke becomes. Luke fights with compassion, but without doubt. Luke's compassion does not make him passive. It makes him measured. Gemso is built for Jedi who can feel deeply, yet refuse to be consumed. Jedi who can strike decisively, yet without cruelty. Jedi who know that mercy sometimes means stopping a threat immediately rather than letting it escalate. And Luke walks that line. He doesn't fall to Form 7's abandon. He doesn't fall into Form 3's endless waiting. He moves forward when the Force requires it, and only then. That is why he can wield Gemso with such clarity. The galaxy's most naturally gifted Gemso practitioner, its purest practitioner. Luke is born with an innate connection to the form, strength, instinct, the Skywalker sense of the Force. But here's the turning point. What happens when someone this naturally gifted starts to truly think about Gemso? When someone who is already dominating the blade binds, already overwhelms opponents with strength, already flows with the will of the Force, what happens when they then begin to study the art respectfully and thoughtfully? As Grandmaster, that potential fully manifested itself in war. On the open battlefield, Luke Skywalker cleaves through Yuzhong Vong warriors in one era, and in others, he rips apart war droids with the same terrifying efficiency. In these moments, Gemso is not just a dueling form, it is the weapon he brings to bear on armies. It is a blend of strength, precision, and perfectly directed intent that ends threats in a handful of strokes. That transformation, Luke Skywalker shifting from instinct to intention, this marks the beginning of a completely new phase of his lightsaber journey. Because once Luke starts thinking about combat, analyzing combat, and adapting to new enemies, he begins adding entirely new layers to that foundation. This is where Jar Kai enters. This is where Lumiya forces Luke to evolve again. This is where his students, Jaina Solo, Jason Solo, and Kyle Katarn learn from him and reflect his growing mastery. And this is where Luke's path leaves the boundaries of the classical forms entirely. Up until this point, his combat style has been driven by instinct, necessity, and potential. He mirrors Vader to survive. He channels the Skywalker strength without fully understanding it. He wields Gemso emotionally rather than technically. But that changes the moment he begins to think about combat, to analyze, to deconstruct, and to deliberately refine his technique. This transition begins with one of the most unorthodox duels of his entire career. Lumiya forces Luke into a new discipline, Jar Kai. Lumiya's light whip is unlike anything Luke has ever faced. Its reach, its flexibility, its unpredictability make a single blade guard almost useless. Luke quickly realizes the traditional Gemso cannot protect him from a weapon that can bend, coil, and strike from multiple angles simultaneously. To survive, Luke adapts, just as he once adapted to Vader. Luke takes up a Shoto, a short-bladed lightsaber alongside his main, this one containing a red crystal. Some even theorize that this is Darth Vader's lightsaber crystal that Luke took from him on the second Death Star, but that's a theory for another holocron. This is Luke's first true foray in Jar Kai, the art of dual blade combat. But unlike traditional Jar Kai practitioners, who tend to use both blades offensively, Luke approaches the discipline different. The Shoto becomes a shield against the whip. The full-length blade becomes his offensive counterstrike. His footwork and angles shift towards closing distance rapidly. His stance tightens, allowing him to intercept the whip's arcs. This is not Jar-Kai as two equally dominant blades. This is Jar-Kai as an answer, a specific countermeasure forged through necessity. Once again, an enemy unintentionally becomes one of Luke's greatest teachers, and this new discipline does not fade. Luke will call on Jar-Kai again in some of the most dangerous battles of his life, including his fight against the Supreme Overlord Shimra Jermaine, where dual blades give him decisive control over an environment filled with unpredictable threats. But Jar-Kai is not the only part of Luke's next evolution. The Praxium years, when Luke becomes a teacher and his forms mature. With the founding of the Jedi Praxium, Luke enters a new age of development. Teaching forces Luke to articulate, to analyze, and refine techniques that he once used purely on instinct. This is where Luke's foundation in Gemso becomes fully intentional, and where his hybrid style expands through structure study and reflection. Luke teaches Form 5 to Jaina Solo, to Kyle Katarn, to Kip Duran, and Jason Solo. Not vaguely, not generally. Luke teaches Gemso directly. These students learn the blade binds, power counters, momentum control, the very principles Luke once applied instinctively against Vader. And they recognize something staggering about their teacher. Luke's strength in a bind feels limitless. Jaina states that Luke could use her own power against her, redirecting her strength into vulnerabilities that she never noticed. This is an evolved, intentional use of Gemso's core philosophy, taking the opponent's aggression and turning it into your advantage. Through teaching, Luke is no longer imitating Vader, he's surpassing him, and he's surpassing Anakin as well. As Grandmaster and instructor, Luke expands beyond Form 5. Sarisu gives him patience and defensive control. Ataru gives him explosive mobility and physical attacks. Niman gives him fluid integration of all of the techniques and force abilities. And Jar-Kai gives him adaptability against unconventional weapons and multiple enemies. Luke uses each form as a tool, nothing more, nothing less. He selects the right approach for the right duel, the right enemy, the right moment. This is where Luke begins to transcend the classical forms entirely. He blends them so seamlessly that his technique becomes a personal art, a synthesis only he can wield, built on instinct, experience, and philosophical clarity. But even as Luke absorbs all of these influences, the spine of his combat style never changes. It is always built on Gemso. His stance, his guards, his entries, his counters, his binds, everything returns to the foundation that Vader forced him to learn and that Luke perfected through decades of study. Luke's combat identity becomes a wheel with many spokes, but Form 5 remains the hub. Jaina Solo and Jason Solo become the reflection of their master. Two of Luke's most important students become the mirror that proves his mastery. Jason Solo, who would later become Darth Kaitis. Luke trains him in Form 5 and later sees Jason turn those same teachings and techniques into something terrifying. Kaitis becomes extremely dangerous partially because Luke taught him so well. Jaina Solo, the Sword of the Jedi. Jaina is one of the few who trains with Luke extensively in saber combat. She learns Gemso directly from the Grandmaster, and her duels consistently show the influence of Luke's philosophy, counters, pressure control, and overwhelming blade dominance. Luke thinks, learns, and evolves. Jar-Kai, Sarisu, Ataru, Niman, Gemso, hybridization, force integration, Grandmaster's intuition. He doesn't master one form, he masters all of them, and then he blends them into something only he can wield. But no matter how far he evolves, one truth always remains. Luke Skywalker is a Form 5 duelist at his core, not because he chose it, but because the galaxy forced him to choose it. The Sith forced him to choose it. So yeah, while we said at the beginning of this video that it was going to be a strictly technical breakdown of Luke's lightsaber technique, you already know how it goes here at the archives. We never miss a chance to glaze the Grandmaster. But the truth is, there's something fascinating about Luke's evolution, not just from an in-universe perspective, but from a meta, storytelling point of view. Luke's style doesn't exist in a vacuum. It mirrors the stories, the characters, the lineage that came before. When you stop and look back at the broader Jedi lineage, Luke is the natural continuation of a chain that starts long before he was ever born. Luke mirrors Anakin, Anakin mirrors Dooku, and Vader mirrors what Anakin could have become. Anakin didn't just learn flashy moves from Dooku, he learned precision, he learned timing, he learned how a real master manipulates tempo and the geometry of a duel. Anakin learned why technique matters, why intention matters, and Anakin internalized that. so much so that when he became Vader, when his mobility was crippled and limited, when the speed that defined him was torn away, he turns back to the precision that Dooku drilled into him. Vader compensates with Gem So, but that old Makashi discipline is still there beneath the armor. This is the same cycle that Luke inherits. Luke's Gem So is a continuation of Anakin's philosophy, but tempered with compassion, clarity, and restraint. Luke is what Anakin should have been. He is the perfected version of Form 5 that Anakin never reached, the balanced expression of strength and mercy. And if you want to take things into a dark, twisted what-if scenario, think about this. If Luke Skywalker is the perfected light side evolution of Form 5, then a full potential Vader, a Vader unbroken, unlimited, unrestrained, would be the dark side mirror of that same perfection. A duel between full potential Darth Vader and Grandmaster Luke as we see in Legends, that would be one of the most mind-bending thought experiments in Star Wars history. But the fact of the matter remains the same. Luke Skywalker took the form farther than anyone else. A Jedi's lightsaber is far more than a simple weapon. It is the culmination of a journey, a bond between the Force and its wielder, and a reflection of the Jedi's very soul. Each kyber crystal tuned through meditation and attunement carries with it the essence of the Jedi who has claimed it. When that Jedi dies, their lightsaber does not simply become scrap metal, it becomes a relic, a lingering echo of the person who once carried it. When Qui-Gon Jinn was struck down by Darth Maul on Naboo, his death was a pivotal moment in galactic history. It marked the resurgence of the Sith, set Anakin Skywalker on his tragic path, and forced Obi-Wan Kenobi to step into the role of a Jedi Knight and a mentor. But as Qui-Gon's body was burned on Naboo's funeral pyre, one question now lingers. What happened to Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber? Unlike Anakin's weapon, which was passed through generations as a symbol of hope and despair, Qui-Gon's lightsaber simply vanishes from the narrative. But across both continuities, there are fascinating clues and even deeper symbolic truths that give us a sense of the weapon's ultimate fate. Greetings again, lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. Before we document the journey of Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber after his death, we have had a terrible vision in the Force. Many who use our archives are not yet subscribed, so if you've been enjoying the daily holocron uploads, reach out and crush the subscribe button. It is your destiny. To understand the fate of Qui-Gon's weapon, we first need to understand what makes a lightsaber so significant in the first place. At the heart of every lightsaber lies the kyber crystal. These are not simple inert stones, they are living, resonant conduits of the Force. When a Jedi initiate first constructs their lightsaber, they undergo a process known as the Gathering. Younglings journey to Ilum or other kyber-rich worlds to claim a crystal for themselves, guided only by the Force itself. Once bonded, the crystal becomes attuned to the Jedi's unique signature in the Force, resonating with their own inner self and their own identity. That's why a crystal can change color when bonded with a Jedi, and why a Sith's corruption of one can turn it crimson, making it bleed. Luke Skywalker himself explained this bond, and he reflected on it when wielding Anakin's blue lightsaber. Luke admitted it always felt good and proper in his hand, but it was never truly his. Only when Luke built his own lightsaber did he feel whole, because a saber is not just a tool, it is an extension of the self. This truth tells us something profound. When another Jedi wields a fallen comrade's lightsaber, they are not merely borrowing a weapon, they are carrying a piece of the Jedi's essence with them. The blade still whispers of its former master, and in the case of Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber, that resonance would play a crucial role in Obi-Wan's journey moving forward. In Legends continuity, the story of Qui-Gon's lightsaber does not end on Naboo. After the duel with Maul, Obi-Wan Kenobi would take up his master's weapon, and remarkably, he continued to wield it for several years. The novel Rogue Planet, set roughly 2 years after The Phantom Menace, explicitly shows Obi-Wan using Qui-Gon Jinn's green-bladed lightsaber. This is an incredible detail. The Jedi tradition generally encouraged the construction of one's own weapon after knighthood, especially if the Padawan has lost their weapon prior. But for Obi-Wan, to carry Qui-Gon's lightsaber for years tells us how deeply connected he remained to his fallen master, how much he still relied on him, how even after his physical death, Obi-Wan always thought of Qui-Gon as his greatest teacher. On one hand, this choice may be seen as practical. Obi-Wan had only now just become a Jedi Knight, and perhaps did not immediately wish to construct a brand new lightsaber while traveling and training with a young Anakin. But the emotional resonance is undeniable. Obi-Wan didn't wield this lightsaber for weeks, he used it for years. By using Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber, Obi-Wan was keeping his master's presence close, guided still by the wisdom of his master even in death. This continuity also hints at Obi-Wan's struggle with his own identity. For a time, he was more an extension of Qui-Gon than even his own man, clinging to the lightsaber as a physical reminder of the master that he both loved, and in many ways, that he grew to resent. Eventually, Obi-Wan grew into his own. He constructed his second blue lightsaber, signaling his maturity as a Jedi Guardian, more pragmatic and orthodox than his maverick master. After this point, unfortunately Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber disappears from any historical record that we can find. We don't know if it was dismantled, recycled, or hidden away. But the fact that Obi-Wan carried it for years shows us how much he relied on Qui-Gon's influence during his formative years of his own Jedi knighthood. But Qui-Gon's lightsaber also symbolizes something deeper: Obi-Wan's conflicted relationship with his master. While he clearly loved and admired Qui-Gon, there was also tension between them. Qui-Gon often disregarded the High Council, while Obi-Wan was far more orthodox. Most significantly, Qui-Gon's dying wish was to have Obi-Wan train Anakin. This placed an enormous burden on him. Obi-Wan honored the request, but it was not his choice. For years, Obi-Wan wrestled with the consequences of that vow, and when Anakin eventually fell to the dark side, that promise became the root of Obi-Wan's greatest pain. Carrying Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber after his death reflects this tension. On one level, it was a gesture of loyalty and love, keeping his master close. On another, it may have represented the heavy weight of expectation that Qui-Gon now placed on him. The blade was both comfort and chain, a reminder of the vow that would eventually shatter Obi-Wan's life. This is why in later years, when Qui-Gon's spirit communed with Obi-Wan on Tatooine, there was always a lingering sense that Obi-Wan never fully forgave him. And perhaps that is why, in the end, Obi-Wan abandoned Qui-Gon's lightsaber to truly embrace his own identity and become his own Jedi. To do that, he had to set aside and to build his own. In canon, Qui-Gon's lightsaber takes on a different fate. The High Republic novels and comics have introduced the Memorial Arch, located in the lower levels of the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. The arch is not built out of stone, it is constructed of kyber crystals, each one taken from the saber of a fallen Jedi who is joined with the Force. When a Jedi dies, their kyber crystal is often removed from their weapon and fused into this arch. This creates a living monument, a structure that resonates with the voices of countless Jedi who have come before, immortalized in the Force. The other parts of the saber, its metal hilt and focusing components, are likely recycled for use by younglings in the construction of their own lightsabers. If this tradition was still active by the time of Qui-Gon's death, then it is very likely that his green kyber crystal now rests within that very arch, glowing alongside those of thousands of others. This would mean Qui-Gon is not remembered through his weapon in battle, but through his eternal presence in the temple itself. This answer strips away some of the intimacy of Obi-Wan carrying the lightsaber for years though, but it does reinforce the Jedi's philosophy of community. A lightsaber in this view is not meant to be a relic of attachment, but rather a contribution to the living history of the Order. But many don't believe this. Among fans, there is a popular theory that Obi-Wan may have secretly kept Qui-Gon's lightsaber, or at least its crystal, later passing it down to Luke Skywalker. This idea that Luke Skywalker's green lightsaber in Return of the Jedi is powered by Qui-Gon's crystal is a symbolic inheritance, linking master to master across several generations. It's a beautiful idea. Qui-Gon was the Jedi who discovered Anakin and believed in his potential. How fitting then, if his crystal should one day empower the blade of Anakin's own son, eventually having its own part in redeeming Vader. But this theory does not hold up in either continuity. In the EU, Luke constructs his green saber on Tatooine with guidance from Obi-Wan's journals. In Legends and Shadow of the Empire, it makes it explicit. Luke creates a synthetic crystal, using techniques once employed by the Sith. This is because Palpatine's purges have made natural crystals extremely rare. He's destroyed a lot of Ilum and other locations that used to be rich in kyber, not wanting the next generation of Jedi to have any access to the kyber. Still though, this fan theory persists because it captures something very symbolic. The idea that lightsabers are vessels of legacy, passing through generations, carrying whispers of those who have come before. So what became of Qui-Gon Jinn's lightsaber? In Legends, it lived on through Obi-Wan, a weapon carried not just out of necessity, but out of loyalty and out of grief. A weapon that took Obi-Wan Kenobi 2 years to eventually put away and let rest, showing just how impactful Qui-Gon Jinn really was on Obi-Wan. The lightsaber symbolized the bond between master and apprentice, the heavy weight of Qui-Gon's final wish. In other continuities, it likely joined the Kyber Memorial Arch in the Jedi Temple, a glowing testament of Qui-Gon's eternal place within the Jedi. And in fan imagination, it may have reached Luke Skywalker himself, carried across time as a secret inheritance. But no matter the version, Qui-Gon's lightsaber embodies a truth central to Star Wars. These weapons are not just tools of war, they are living extensions of the Force. They are conduits of memory and essence, and when a Jedi passes, their saber remains behind, not empty, but echoing with their presence. And so, even if the physical fate of Qui-Gon's lightsaber remains unclear, its meaning continues to resonate. Through Obi-Wan, through the Jedi Temple, and through the legends told by fans, the lightsaber whispers the legacy of a Jedi who first believed in the Chosen One. In Star Wars Legends, the era of the New Republic was sort of a return to the primeval age for Force wielders. Both the Jedi and Sith hit a hard reset, with only a handful of their kind existing. Luke's Jedi Academy, or Jedi Praxium, consisted of only himself and a few dozen students, taking the galaxy back to its very early days. But it seems as though every few thousand years, a schism occurs in the Jedi Order which results in an antithetical sect of Dark Jedi. And unfortunately, Grandmaster Luke would be forced to experience this repeated Jedi pastime. A dark, twisted mirror of Luke Skywalker's own Jedi Academy would take form when one of his fallen students began his own school, a school that exclusively trained Dark Jedi. Greetings again, lore junkies, and welcome back to the archives. In today's holocron, we're going to be talking about the Shadow Academy, the evil Praxium that bred Dark Jedi for the Empire. My friends, you can be assured that unlike the Shadow Academy, our archives have no sinister intention of brainwashing you to be an Imperial Jedi, but to battle against such misinformation, you must become knowledgeable of the deepest Legends lore. So if you enjoyed today's holocron, be sure to reach out and crush the subscribe button. It is your destiny. Now, let us begin. The antithesis of the Jedi Temple, the Shadow Academy, begins with a single man, a fallen student by the name of Brachus. Though it is a debate whether he was really risen at all. Born on the planet of Mist, Brachus was taken in by Imperial Inquisitors and was raised as nothing more than a tool for their sinister purpose. By the time he was a young man in the year 11 ABY, the remnant of the Empire discovered that Luke Skywalker was attempting to revive the Jedi Order on Yavin 4. In order to sabotage these efforts, the Inquisitors dispatched Brachus as a spy in order to join Luke's academy and destroy it from the inside. However, the wise Grandmaster Luke instantly recognized Brachus' true nature and loyalty, and discerned his intentions right out of the gate. But he was not willing to give up on the young man's destiny. Perceiving his strength in the Force, Luke decided to take him in as a student anyway, and devoted his time to turning him to the light side once and for all. By all accounts, he was successful, and Brachus indeed integrated himself successfully with the other Jedi legitimately. He even helped them destroy the spirit of Exar Kun as a noble Jedi student. Over the next several years, Brachus continued absorbing Luke's training, but in the year 14 ABY, Luke decided it was time to give him a test of character. Luke chose to take Brachus through a dark side trial similar to the one that he had experienced on Dagobah with Yoda. This was a common test that Luke employed with students who struggled with their inner darkness. Rather than having them fear it, Luke would organize a trial to make them confront and ultimately overcome it. In his mind, this was the way that Luke attempted to make sure that there were no repeats of his own father, Anakin. It was the secret to making sure his students always knew how to combat the dark side rather than be seduced by it. Luke didn't want them ignorant of its temptations or vulnerable to its ways. Unfortunately, this wasn't always successful though, and in the case of Brachus, it backfired on the Grandmaster dramatically. Brachus was sent on an illusionary quest that would seem very real. It was designed to force Brachus to look inside himself and to face his own nature. Skywalker hoped that the test would heal Brachus and help him overcome his own inner dark side, leading him to accepting that being a Jedi was a greater calling than a life as an Imperial agent. But Brachus found only his self-deception, and the fact that the Empire could force him to do great evil, even against his own nature. Faced with the evil inside of his own heart, Brachus attempted to escape, to turn away, to hide from the reality that was his own soul. However, Luke forced Brachus to delve even deeper into his own nature, facing the lies of his very existence as a Jedi. The ordeal nearly broke Brachus' mind. Unprepared to confront what he truly was, he failed the test and instead found that it had broken something deep within him. Brachus emerged from the illusion terrified and enraged. Blaming Luke for breaking him, he fled to his ship and left the Jedi Academy. Luke mourned the loss of his pupil with such high potential, but he knew that he could not force Brachus to stay and be a Jedi. But letting him go turned out to be a massive mistake. Many years would pass, and Brachus would return in the year 23 ABY, working for the Second Imperium. The Second Imperium was one of the final sects of the Imperial Remnant, and possibly one of its most powerful. The Second Imperium had a mysterious leader that claimed to be Palpatine resurrected yet again, though it was later revealed that this was actually an imposter. Palpatine was long dead, with his final clone body having died in the year 10 ABY on the world of Onderon. This new leader, however, believed that the Second Imperium needed its own Imperial Jedi in order to unite the remaining warlords and to defeat the New Republic. Brachus was the one chosen by the Palpatine imposter to create the Anti-Academy in order to undermine and destroy Luke Skywalker's Jedi Order. And so, therefore was born the Shadow Academy. Brachus would begin finding Force-sensitive recruits on worlds such as Dathomir, where he allied with what remained of the Night Sisters. His circle of evil leadership included Tamith Kai, Vonda Ra, and Garowin. Tamith Kai would be his second in command, and one of his chief instructors of the other Dark Jedi cadets. The base of this school would be an orbital battle station. Its appearance was reminiscent of the Trade Federation dreadnoughts, but instead of a sphere in the center, there was a large castle-like structure. It was ringed with defensive turbolasers and engines for hyperspace travel. But most importantly, the system was equipped with a cloaking device in order to make it completely undetectable, allowing the Academy to operate in total secrecy. Now, unbeknownst to Brachus, the Shadow Academy battle station had another feature as well. The faux Emperor had rigged it with thousands of explosive charges that could be activated remotely. This was a safeguard that the leader had instilled just in case Brachus and the Dark Jedi ever betrayed their creator. This fake Palpatine may not be the real deal, but this was certainly a stroke of sinister genius worthy of the original. Recruitment, however, would prove to be a challenge, as even Luke himself had difficulty locating Force sensitives in the galaxy. But the Shadow Academy used much different methods of acquiring their cadets. Beginning on Dathomir, the witches gathered a sufficient amount of Force-sensitive youths that they were already aware of. Then they scoured all of those already within the Second Imperium's army. Brachus had stolen a Jedi detection device from Luke, which was a technological piece of equipment that could read Force signatures within another being. It was one of the methods the Empire used to locate hiding Jedi in public back in the day. Using the device, he would screen through all of the conscripts and trainees that were pulled from the Empire's ranks. And finally, Brachus dispatched agents into the galaxy to locate potential Force sensitives on the fringes of society. They went to places in the underworld such as Coruscant, where they could locate exceptional children on the street, those that had already been cast out of society, and took them and trained them as Dark Jedi. This method was particularly cunning, as it was something that the Sith did long ago. It was important to find those strong in the Force that had already been wounded in life. The way the Master could prey on those existing dark side feelings in order to make them more powerful. And one of the strongest members of the Shadow Academy came from this very origin, but we'll get to him in a moment. Once the trainees are selected, they would begin their training. Just like in Luke Skywalker's Praxium, living conditions were a main contributor to the training itself. Tamith Kai enforced harsh discipline on the initiates. She believed that adversity and deprivation were necessary to hone a student's power. Under her direction, students lived in Spartan-like conditions. They were each given barren cubicle chambers for sleeping and for meditation. These rooms were dim and had no comforts whatsoever. The trainees were expected to meditate, to practice assignments, and build their Force abilities in solitude. Tamith Kai, who was a more experienced wielder of the dark side, knew that hardship was what bred strong Darksiders. The solitude was so that each Dark Jedi could learn to rely on themselves and their own inner power. They'd develop alone so that they would not become a liability to someone else, or learn to rely on others, forming strong attachments. But for those that still required some convincing to embrace the dark side, a torture chamber awaited them. The unwitting initiate would be forced into what would first appear to be an empty room, but then they would be assaulted with strobing lights and extreme temperature alterations. After this, they would be blasted with jets of near freezing water, all to bring them to their physical and their psychological limit. Once all of that was complete, the final phase would take place to complete their dark side conversion. A hatch in the ceiling would drop a heavy sonic generator into the room, one that released an agonizingly loud shriek. The instructor overseeing the torture would taunt and encourage the victim that the only way to stop the scream was to use the dark side to save themselves. This was a very efficient and a streamlined way of turning those recruits or deepening their existing connection to the darkness. The only time these trainees really had social interaction with one another was during lectures or during brutal training exercises. Dozens of students would attend Brachus's lectures in a meeting room, where he taught the philosophy of glorified power and conflict. He would also project holographic images of cataclysms, such as exploding stars or other violent events. Himself and his students were taught to meditate on these destructive images, to strengthen their resolve in the dark side. Training drills involved chambers full of various technological exercises which were often life-threatening. One such chamber generated holographic enemies which simulated dueling opponents or blaster-wielding remotes. This would test their lightsaber skills in both weapon combat and blaster deflection. Another chamber they had saw a group of blindfolded students being armed with only wooden sticks. They were then made to deflect objects automatically launched at them with increasing lethality. It began with balls, then rocks, and eventually knives. At least 6 students died during this specific exercise during the Academy's operation. Once they proved themselves worthy, the trainees were gifted a red lightsaber. Rather than constructing it themselves, the lightsabers were mass-produced and handed out once they attained enough skill to wield one. There was not a lot of ceremony or importance placed upon lightsabers at all in this academy, which is in strict contrast to Luke's. They were tools and weapons. They were not viewed as companions or symbols like the Jedi and the Sith view them. Now we move on to the ultimate plan for the Academy. The Academy's major objective was to weaken Luke Skywalker's ranks while simultaneously bolstering their own. In order to do this, they boldly kidnapped several Padawans from Luke's order on Yavin 4, including the twins of Leia, Jacen, and Jaina Solo. However, the twins showed impressive restraint to torture and indoctrination. They eventually were able to escape with the help of Luke and his student Tenel Kadjo. This great failure ultimately exposed the Shadow Academy's existence to the New Republic, forcing Brachus to change his tactic. He relocated the Shadow Academy near Coruscant to prey on the New Republic's supply lines, and to quietly recruit more followers. They looked around for force wielders among the poor youth and the street gangs. This was when he recruited a young boy by the name of Zek, who had once been a friend of Jacen and Jaina. He had not shown enough force sensitivity to be brought to Luke's academy though, but Brachus could sense his latent power. Brachus trained Zek to be the champion of the Shadow Academy, calling him the Darkest Knight. As a final test, he faced the apprentice of Tamitha Kai in single combat. The contest would decide who would become the leader of the Dark Jedi. Zek executed the Academy's best student and ultimately became their Dark Leader. Under Zek's command, the Second Imperium launched a raid on a major computer research center on the world of Kashyyyk. During the assault, Zek was confronted by his old friend, Jaina Solo. Ultimately, he was unable to bring himself to kill her, and decided to honor their friendship for old time's sake. Doing her one last favor, he warned her that the Jedi Praxium on Yavin 4 was the Second Imperium's next target. With this warning being taken seriously, Luke and his Jedi prepared themselves for the climactic assault that the Shadow Academy would enact on the Praxium. The Second Imperium committed all of its forces into the attack of Yavin, just as Zek had promised to Jaina. The Shadow Academy and an Imperial fleet established a blockade around the moon, while Dark Jedi and Stormtroopers invaded the surface. Luckily, Admiral Akbar and the New Republic arrived in order to engage the Imperium's fleet, while the Jedi repelled the siege below. Tenel Kadjo, however, was also a former Night Sister, who was able to kill the Dark Jedi Tamitha Kai in a climactic duel, therefore ridding the Academy of one of its chief operators. Meanwhile, Luke took on Brachus, and it goes without saying that he was ultimately successful. But Luke only disarmed him, having compassion on his former student, and spared his life. His loss was such a humiliation that Brachus fled with his tail tucked as their assault began to crumble. Brachus ran to the chambers of the quote-unquote Emperor in order to ask for guidance. But what he found was the truth of the charade. Their leader was nothing more than a lifelike hologram being operated by 4 of the last remaining royal guards. But in order to keep their dark secret from getting out, they activated the Shadow Academy's self-destruct mechanism. Without a countdown, the station exploded out of the sky above Yavin, ending the lives of Brachus, the guardsmen, and all of the remaining Dark Jedi. And with it, that is the end of the Shadow Academy. Not long after this, the entire Second Imperium and its movement would implode as well. In the aftermath, the Dark Jedi surrendered and were taken prisoner.
Many of them, such as Zek, renounced the dark side and were later integrated into Luke's Jedi Academy for an ultimate chance at redemption. However, several others were too far gone. Two specific students, Lomi Plo and Welk, would go on to join Darth Krayt's One Sith Order. And so, my friends, this was the origin and the structure as well as the story of the Dark Jedi Anti-Academy that attempted to destroy Luke's. I think it's thematically appropriate that Grandmaster Luke got to deal with his own version of the Great Schism. However, he got to mend the mistakes of the Jedi of the past. Luke did not let the Shadow Academy turn into something serious like the Legions of Leto or the Sith Order, fixing the mistakes from the first and the second Great Schism. Rather, Luke dealt with the situation with patience, courage, and most importantly, compassion. It may seem like weakness that he spared his old apprentice, and even gave the Dark Jedi a chance at rehabilitation. But Luke showed that his Jedi were supposed to be different. Luke believed that the dark side was not a permanent, predestined path, but they all deserved a chance at redemption. Not to mention most of these trainees were forcibly turned to the dark side and warped by the Dark Academy. A little kindness went a long way for those former dark side apprentices. The price of power. The dark side gives, and then it takes everything away. Every Sith Lord learns that truth, but only at the end, when the power they command begins to consume them from within. The dark side does not age its servants as time does. It hollows them. It burns them from the inside out, until the flesh softens and the soul grows brighter and more unstable, straining against the mortal shell that contains it. For most Sith, that destruction comes quickly. For Sidious, it came slowly. He had become the living embodiment of the dark side, a being so powerful that even his victories poisoned him. And unlike those who came before, he understood what was happening to his body. He had seen it in the ancient texts. He knew that the same fire that elevated him would one day devour him. But he believed that he could think his way past it. He believed that knowledge, control, and the dark side would outlast this decay. He believed he could master the very force that was killing him. The dark side was a flame, and he was certain that he was its keeper. But a flame does not serve. It only ever burns. In Dark Empire, we learned something new about Palpatine. Palpatine avoided fighting Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi and engaging with him in a duel. He didn't avoid fighting Luke out of mercy or out of arrogance. He did it out of a very real fear. Not necessarily fear for Luke's strength, but fear of his own decay. By the time of Return of the Jedi, the Emperor's body was rotting from decades of channeling the dark side. Every burst of power burned through him, threatening to unravel the fragile vessel that still contained his spirit. It began slowly. At first, the power felt divine. The blood hums with energy. Every sense sharpens. The air itself feels alive beneath your skin. You feel limitless. You feel immortal. Then the current begins to turn. The blood thickens. The heart struggles. The muscles ache not from exertion, but from resistance. The body begins to reject the power that sustains it. The force stops flowing through you. It starts to move you, to puppeteer your failing flesh like a marionette. You have become a corpse animated by the power of your own will. This was the state that Darth Sidious lived in. Every movement was an act of command, every breath a struggle of focus. His body was no longer his. It was a dying vessel kept alive by the dark side's refusal to let him rest. The dark side was not content with simply empowering him. It needed to inhabit him. And it was tearing him apart from the inside out. By the time he was Emperor for nearly 2 decades, he could feel it under his skin, the crackle of energy pressing against its boundaries, desperate to escape. Every surge of power risked burning the flesh away completely. He had become a living paradox of Sith power, power so absolute that it destroyed its master. He wasn't being chased by death any longer. Death was inside him, clawing its way out piece by piece, while the dark side refused to release its prize. This was the Emperor's existence in his final years, the most powerful being in the galaxy trapped in a cage of decaying flesh. It was in this state of decline that the Emperor first heard the name Luke Skywalker, a pilot, a hero of the rebellion, a boy. At first he thought it was a coincidence, a name borrowed from history. Then he felt it, the spark. The force trembled. It carried an unmistakable signature, bright, powerful, defiant. A Skywalker. And for the first time in decades, the Emperor hesitated. He remembered the first, the chosen one, the child that he had molded since youth, the apprentice that he had broken, reshaped, and corrupted into a perfect monster. Anakin had been predictable, ambitious, arrogant, ruled by his passion. He could be manipulated because he needed to be understood. But Luke was different. He was not a creation of the dark side. He was an anomaly born beyond Palpatine's reach, untouched by the corrupting influence of power. He was pure potential, shaped by compassion, friendship, and faith in the way of the Jedi. And that frightened the Emperor more than anything in his life. When Sidious first confirmed the boy's identity, his instinct was not curiosity, it was actual fear. The Emperor immediately considered eliminating him, perhaps even sending his strongest hand, Mara Jade, to do the job. This was the first reaction to Luke, not the hunger to corrupt, but the impulse to erase. Because this time, the Force had created something outside of his design, and the Emperor could not abide by what he could not control. But to understand exactly where this story comes from, much of what it follows is informed by what will come after Return of the Jedi, from Dark Empire, a series published in the early 1990s that takes place after Return of the Jedi. In Dark Empire, the Emperor returns from death through alchemy and cloning, revealing that his apparent demise on Endor was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a far greater transformation. The series drastically reshaped how we interpret Palpatine's final years, showing that his decay, his paranoia, and obsession with immortality were not simply the consequences of age, but were a part of a deliberate and a terrifying plan to transcend death itself. What makes Dark Empire especially significant is that it retroactively alters how we see the events in Return of the Jedi. It reframes Palpatine's weakness, his hesitation to fight Luke, and his physical deterioration as a result of a deeper lore, the rot of the dark side consuming him from within, while at the same time preparing for his rebirth on the hidden world of Bespin. So while Dark Empire takes place long after Endor, it gives us a clearer lens through which to understand why Palpatine acted as he did in Return of the Jedi, and specifically, why he didn't confront Luke at the lightsaber or with the Force here, instead operating through proxies, why he was afraid to face Luke, but also why he hid his true power, why in the end, death itself was another step in his design. Palpatine had spent his entire life perfecting the rule of two, the belief that the dark side was not meant to conquer through armies, but through infection. The Sith were not soldiers, they were parasites. They conquered not by war, but through corruption. The strong ruled from the shadows, turning others into extensions of their will. Violence was for the impatient. True dominance came from control. That was why Sidious had built the Empire as he did. Not as a legion of warlords, but as a pyramid of dependence. Every admiral, every governor, every inquisitor, even Vader was just another puppet, dancing to the rhythm of Sidious's mind. To unleash raw power was to waste. To strike directly was to abandon mastery for chaos. The Emperor did not destroy his enemies, he converted them. He didn't crush civilizations, he taught them to enslave themselves. It was that ideology that shaped his reaction to Luke. He could not simply kill the boy. That was the act of a barbarian, not the act of a master. The rule of two demanded patience, subtlety, control. He wanted Luke to follow his own will, to validate the Sith philosophy one more time. But beneath the calm calculation, Sidious knew the truth. He could not afford confrontation. His body was failing. His power was unstable. He could destroy Luke, yes, but he may destroy himself in the process. And so he elected restraint. He would let Vader act as his sword, his instrument of temptation and of fear. The Master would remain in the shadows, preserving the illusion of control. However, while the cage of flesh continued to rot. While the galaxy fought and burned, the Emperor's true empire was built in secret, not on Coruscant, but on the hidden world known as Bespin. To the lucky few, Bespin was a paradise, a reward for loyalty, a refuge of peace, safety, and beauty under the Emperor's watchful and loving eye. The transports descended through perfect skies, greeted by gleaming cities of marble and glass. Every street radiated calm, every tower shone white beneath an endless sun. Citizens walked in harmony, their hearts light, their minds at peace. They believed that they had escaped the chaos of the galaxy and found eternal serenity. But serenity is the mask of slavery. The air carried something else, a subtle hum, a whisper that pressed gently against one's mind. At night, the citizens slept deeply. They dreamed of light, of joy, of service. Each morning they awoke slightly weaker, slightly more docile, and none of them ever questioned why.
because Bis was not a paradise. It was a battery. Every heartbeat on its surface fed the Emperor. Every sigh, every dream, every thought bled into the dark side and up towards the throne. The planet had been turned into a wound, a living engine designed to sustain its master. Beneath its shining streets stretched a labyrinth of laboratories and chambers. Cloning vats lined the walls, rows of half-formed bodies suspended in green light, some human, some monstrous, all bred for a single purpose, to either serve as vessels for Palpatine's soul, or monsters for the Dark Empire. In the depths, scientists and adepts worked in silence, mixing science with sorcery. Above them, in a black spire that pierced the clouds, the Emperor wrote, filling holocrons with dark side knowledge and tales of immortality, meditations on the nature of the soul, doctrines on control. Bis was not merely a world, it was a monastery, his laboratory, the Emperor's heart. To Darth Sidious, it was perfection. A world where every being served its purpose. A society without rebellion, without disorder, without choice. It was the rule of two written across a planet. One master, infinite servants. But the perfection was an illusion. Every day as Bis fed him, the fire within him burned hotter. He was devouring paradise, and paradise was dying beneath his feet. On Bis, Palpatine ceased to be a ruler and became something else. He became something closer to a god of the dark side. He had learned to send his mind beyond the body, into the void beneath life and death. He explored the currents of a realm known as chaos, where most spirits dissolve, and he began to map them. He discovered that the dark side could preserve identity through sheer will, that a spirit could persist as long as it refused to yield. He would not simply survive death, he would learn to rule it. His essence transfer experiments were no longer theory, they became ritual. Sidious practiced displacing fragments of his will into these cloned bodies, then pulling them back again, perfecting the art of rebirth. He was becoming something older than the rule of two. He no longer sought to rule from the shadows. He wanted to rule as the ancients did, openly, as a warlord of the dark side. Bis was his cocoon. The galaxy beyond was merely a shell. And yet, a light still burned. Luke Skywalker. Every time Sidious stretched out into the Force, he could feel it. A current of harmony cutting through the darkness. The Jedi. Luke was everything the dark side was not. Compassion, balance, purity. That purity defied the Emperor's logic and his control. He told himself that Luke's fall was inevitable, that every Skywalker eventually surrendered to darkness. But even he knew it wasn't true. Luke was not Anakin. He was what Anakin should have been, what Palpatine could never create. And that's what made him so insanely dangerous. Sidious felt it instinctively. If he confronted Luke before his work was finished, the chaos of the living Force would break him open. And so he waited. He watched. He sent Vader again and again, letting the Apprentice test the boy's strength, erode his hope, draw him closer to the dark side, closer to the precipice. He believed corruption was safer than combat, because a duel with Luke would be a duel with the Force itself. Not that he couldn't beat him, but because he was facing a Skywalker, a wild card and an anomaly. He believed that even should he triumph, his body may be ripped apart. By the time of Return of the Jedi, his decay was undeniable. His cane was no longer a prop. His laughter was masked with agony. His body shook with movement. He looked weak, but his weakness was not the absence of power. It was too much power, trapped beneath dying flesh. The storm within him was beginning to outgrow its cage. One unrestrained moment, one uncontrolled surge of power, and he could ignite himself from the inside out. This is why, before Dark Empire and it recontextualizing the lore, he didn't want to fight Luke directly. He was still the last master of the rule of two, the philosopher of patience, control, and manipulation. He believed subtlety was still his strength, that he could turn Luke as he had turned Anakin, without lifting a blade. But he was standing at the end of the era. The rule of two was dying with him. His body, his restraint, his philosophy, everything that had defined Darth Sidious was collapsing. And when he returned, he would no longer hide like the rule of two. He would no longer manipulate from shadow. He would become what the ancients had been, a conqueror,
a warlord, a god of pure dark energy. The Emperor's final victory. His final form was never meant to come through war. It was meant to come through immortality. The cloning vats were ready. The rituals were complete. He had mapped the void and learned how to cross it. So when Vader turned on him, when the lightning poured through his body and the storm finally escaped its cage, Sidious did not die with a final whimper. Instead, he roared back to reality, because the flesh was gone. The burden was lifted. The storm was free. The man who had ruled through control was about to enter a realm without it, and dominate even that. The galaxy believed the Emperor was dead, that the last shadow of the Sith had been burned away. But in the depths of the deep core, the world of Bis still pulsed. The clones waited. The machines hummed. In the void between life and death, something furious stirred. Once death had lived inside him, now he lived inside death. The cage of flesh was gone, and in Dark Empire, the storm is free. The Palpatine who returns in Dark Empire is not a schemer bound by the rule of two, nor a dying man hiding behind an empire of bureaucracy and fear. He is something unrecognizable and unique. He is a being of willpower reborn through alchemy. Palpatine believes he now possesses the ability and has mastered essence transfer, that if he wants, he can move his spirit endlessly through each clone body. But each clone body is much younger, the limits of Sidious seemingly completely removed. This is Darth Sidious at his absolute peak, when he is the apex predator. He even operates differently, no longer operating like the rule of two Sith did, but is something unbound. He had become an emperor not just of people, but seemingly of reality itself. And we will explore this, the Emperor at his absolute peak, in an upcoming video. The moment where Palpatine seemingly ceases to be a man and becomes something that the galaxy has never seen before. He is literally a storm given form, and this is undeniably his most powerful version. The blade that once saved the galaxy was now falling into its shadows. There was a time when Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber was simply a weapon. It was refined, elegant, and deadly. It was the saber he built as a Jedi Knight, and the one he wielded as a Jedi General during the Clone Wars. For years it was a symbol of hope, a reflection of the Jedi Order's ideals, and a representation of Anakin's brilliance. But then he fell. After Anakin became Darth Vader, the saber was lost. He did not keep it. His master, his former master, had stolen it from him, and he was forced to construct a new crimson weapon. It had never been Obi-Wan's in the first place. He had never built it, refined it, and yet he had stolen it from him. But this would not be the last time that Vader would see the lightsaber of Anakin Skywalker. Instead, his former blade was passed down to his son Luke, first by Obi-Wan, and then by fate itself. When Luke ignited the blade for the very first time, it became something more than a Jedi weapon. It became a link across generations, a memory of a father he never knew, and a tool that would shape his destiny. Years later, Luke carried the saber with him to Cloud City on Bespin. His friends were in danger, Han Solo was captured, and Leia and Chewbacca were trapped in Vader's grasp. And Luke, believing himself ready, walked into a confrontation he could not truly comprehend. The duel between Luke and Vader in the carbon freezing chamber is one of the most iconic in galactic history. Cloaked in steam, lit by molten orange and the hum of lightsabers, the fight was brutal. Vader tested him, toyed with him. Luke struck hard, surprising the Dark Lord with his raw potential. But all of this was not enough. Not yet. In a final devastating blow, Vader severed Luke's right hand, sending both the saber and the Skywalker blood it carried spiraling into the abyss below. It was more than a simple defeat. It was a severance of identity. The son had fallen and the father had won. And as the saber tumbled into the depths of Cloud City, it seemed that the legacy of the Skywalker bloodline had been extinguished fully. But this was not the end. Unseen by the galaxy, far from the eyes of rebellion or the Empire, the blade would continue its journey, lost to the world above momentarily, but not forgotten by the Force. What fell that day was not just a lightsaber, but it was a symbol, and symbols, unlike flesh and blood, do not die easily. What falls can be found, but not always by those who deserve it. The saber did not vanish into myth immediately. Somewhere in the lower industrial shafts of Cloud City, a maintenance drone following its routine cycles detected foreign biological material, organic matter clinging to scorched metal.
Luke's severed hand, still clutching Anakin's lightsaber, had been caught up in a sub-pressure grate, lodged into the framework beneath the city. The drone, indifferent to what it had found, deposited both items into Smelting Core D, a facility used to break down industrial scrap. There, a foreman by the name of Grogan examined the unusual find. The hand, grotesque, unidentifiable, he planned to incinerate. The lightsaber, though, intrigued him. A valuable hilt, possibly black market material, perhaps something that could be repurposed or melted down for parts. But Grogan never got the chance to do it. Darth Vader arrived at the smelting facility unannounced and unchallenged. The Dark Lord had been searching, hunting the saber. Whether it was sentiment, practicality, or something deeper, Vader wanted it back. The Dark Lord confronted Grogan, whose momentary defiance ended the only way such moments ever did. And when Vader departed the facility, he carried with him two items: the lightsaber of Anakin Skywalker and the severed hand of Luke Skywalker. It should have ended here. The blade returned to its rightful owner. A connection, however, twisted between father and son. But even this small, silent victory was denied. When Palpatine learned what Vader had recovered, he issued a command that shocked even the Dark Lord. Delivered the lightsaber and the hand to Mount Tantus. On the surface, it was framed as an order of scientific analysis, preservation of Force-sensitive material, furthering Palpatine's clandestine experiments. But beneath the veneer, there was something far more calculated at play. Palpatine had begun to doubt Darth Vader's loyalty. The events on Bespin had revealed something dangerous. Vader offered him power. He had told him the truth. And now, after that failure, Vader had gone out of his way to retrieve a weapon tied to his past: Anakin's lightsaber and the severed hand of his son. To Palpatine, this was a clear warning sign. Vader was remembering who he had once been. The Emperor knew the dark side required absolute rejection of the past. And while Vader had buried Anakin beneath armor and rage, Luke's appearance had unearthed something dangerous: sentiment. So Palpatine did what he had done for decades. He intervened. He controlled. By demanding that Vader hand over the saber and the hand, Palpatine wasn't just asserting dominance, he was performing a symbolic exorcism, removing any artifact that could awaken Anakin, stripping Vader of the opportunity to dwell on fatherhood, redemption, or rebellion. The blade had become a threat, not because of its power, but because of what it represented: the Jedi, the Son, the man that Vader used to be. But Vader obeyed. He surrendered the lightsaber to Mount Tantus, locked away in one of Emperor Palpatine's most secret storehouses. This weapon was no longer a tool of battle, it had become a pure trophy, a relic, a severed root from a tree that Palpatine believed he had already burned to ash. But the blade would not remain silent forever. The blade had been a symbol of hope. Now it would become a weapon of delusion, though, in a new age. For years, the lightsaber remained buried deep within Mount Tantus. This was one of the Emperor's most secret installations. Hidden on the backwater world of Wayland, the mountain housed artifacts, relics, forbidden knowledge, and experimental cloning research, all held under the watchful eye of Imperial sentinels and twisted scientists. It was here that the Emperor hoarded what he deemed too dangerous or valuable to be known by anyone else, anyone beyond his control, including Vader. And among these was Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber, locked away beside the severed hand of his son. 6 years would pass. With the Empire fractured and the New Republic on the rise, though, the facility remained largely forgotten, a secret held deep. But in the year 9 ABY, it came under the control of a man who should have never existed: Joruus C'baoth. C'baoth was a clone of a Jedi Master, Joruus C'baoth, originally, created by Palpatine during the Clone Wars using samples taken from the doomed Outbound Flight project. But something had gone terribly wrong. The clone's power in the Force had grown wildly unstable, and without proper mental conditioning, he descended into complete madness. He believed himself to be the one true Jedi Master left, maybe the only true Jedi Master ever. Not a clone, not a copy, but the original reborn. And worse, he believed that it was his destiny to rule, not as a Sith Lord, but as a god. When Grand Admiral Thrawn launched his campaign to reclaim the galaxy, he struck a deal with this deadly C'baoth. In exchange for assistance, the Mad Jedi demanded new disciples, specifically Luke Skywalker and Leia Solo, as well as her unborn children. But C'baoth wanted more than just Luke. He wanted control over the Skywalker bloodline. He wanted to mold a Skywalker into his perfect servant, and for that, the Dark Jedi turned to the vaults of Mount Tantus. The severed hand of Luke still contained viable genetic material, and from it, Imperial scientists created a clone, a perfect physical clone of Luke Skywalker, but without his spirit, without his soul. They named the clone Luke. To arm his new creation, Sabaoth retrieved the weapon that had once belonged to both father and son, the blade of Anakin Skywalker. In the hands of Luke, the blade was no longer a legacy, it was an echo twisted into a mockery, a copy wielding a copy, raised by a madman who claimed to be a Jedi. But destiny had not forgotten what the weapon really was. Luke Skywalker led a strike team to Mount Tantus, intent on destroying the Emperor's cloning facility there. There, he confronted the doppelganger. The two clashed in one of the most surreal duels of the post-Imperial era. Luke versus Luke, Skywalker against himself. And yet, it was not Luke who ended this battle. It was Mara Jade, the former Emperor's hand, the assassin who had once been psychically compelled to kill Luke. Now freed from Palpatine's influence, Mara faced the last remnants of the Empire's control, a clone of Luke and a shadow of the Jedi Order corrupted by power. With one strike, she killed the clone, and with a second, she ended Sabaoth. And with that, the twisted legacy of the blade was burned away. After the battle, Luke did something that surprised even Mara. He freely gave her the lightsaber. This wasn't just a gesture of thanks, it was a sign of trust, a belief, and a closure. Because you earned it. Because you're on your way to becoming a Jedi. Mostly though, because I want you to have it. The saber had been passed through Anakin, Obi-Wan, Luke, and now Mara Jade. Each had carried its weight, each had reshaped its purpose, and now it would walk a new path. It was once built by a Jedi, lost to a Sith, and reclaimed by a son. Now it belonged to the assassin who killed in the Emperor's name. When Luke handed Anakin's lightsaber to Mara Jade, it was more than a token of gratitude, it was a closing of a chapter, a redefinition of what the lightsaber had meant. Mara had been one of the Emperor's deadliest tools, an extension of Palpatine's will and the mysterious Emperor's hand. She had hunted Jedi, assassinated traitors, and lived by the belief that she served the greater good. But Palpatine's death had shattered that illusion. His final command to kill Luke Skywalker echoed in her mind as a curse. For years, Mara wrestled with that command. It haunted her, shaped her decisions. She did not know who she truly was without the Emperor's voice in her head. But when she struck down Luke and Sabaoth, she severed the last chains of that control. And in that moment, she became something more than the hand of the Emperor. She became a Jedi in her own right. And while she had a second lightsaber with a purple blade, Anakin's lightsaber remained her most iconic weapon, especially in times of war where its symbolism mattered as much as its power. For the next 3 decades, Mara Jade Skywalker would wield the lightsaber through some of the galaxy's most turbulent conflicts. To her, the lightsaber was more than a weapon. It was a symbol of a truth that she had embraced, a legacy that connected her not only to Luke, but to Anakin. She had once served the man who corrupted Skywalker. Now she wielded the weapon that he had left behind to defend the galaxy and the legacy that he had redeemed. She never used the blade lightly, and when she ignited it, it meant something. But in time, that meaning would grow heavier, more complicated, tragic. Anakin's lightsaber had never stayed in one place for long, and like its previous masters, Mara Jade would not live to see peace. Before a Jedi falls, it is said that the Force whispers, and sometimes you can hear it scream. By 40 ABY, the galaxy teetered on the edge of chaos. The fragile unity built after the Yuzhong Vong War was now fracturing. Old wounds reopened, civil conflict returned, and at the center of the storm stood Jacen Solo, the son of Han and Leia, and the grandson of Anakin. Jacen had once been a philosopher among the Jedi, a questioner of absolutes. He had sought to understand the Force beyond doctrine, beyond boundaries. But as war consumed the galaxy again, his desire for peace began to twist into something darker. He started making choices in secret, choices that mirrored the very path of his grandfather. Visions plagued him, nightmares shaped by the Force. In one such vision, Jacen saw himself standing alone, facing his mother. But Leia was not unarmed. In the vision, Leia ignited a blue lightsaber. Not hers, but the one that had belonged to Anakin, to Luke, to Mara. The lightsaber of Anakin Skywalker. And she had raised it against him. The moment was brief, but it struck Jacen with a force greater than any enemy ever had. The saber was a family heirloom, now represented judgment, a weapon of righteousness, a legacy that had come to reject him. It wasn't just Leia standing in his way. It was everything the Skywalker bloodline had suffered to preserve. It was compassion, redemption, and balance. The vision was the Force showing Jacen the cost of his descent. That even the legacy of Anakin, once the galaxy's greatest cautionary tale, had turned against the rise of another Sith Lord. But this was not a warning that Jacen heeded. He would rename himself Darth Kaitis, and after murdering Mara Jade Skywalker, the most recent bearer of the Anakin blade, he claimed the weapon in cold blood. But even then, the lightsaber was not corrupted. It had not been used in her death. It had not served the dark side. Instead, it had served the vision. The blade had made it clear, whatever darkness Jacen chose to embrace, he would never carry the Skywalker legacy with him. But the lightsaber was never truly lost, only waiting for the one who could understand it. In the aftermath of Mara Jade's death, the lightsaber that belonged to Anakin vanished once more. No ceremony, no records, no honored place in the Jedi Temple. It simply disappeared. For a time it passed through shadows. It surfaced eventually though in the hands of a dark Jedi, one who understood its value not only as a weapon, but as a symbol and as a relic. The Dark Jedi had plans to corrupt the weapon fully, to infuse it with the dark side, to twist its legacy into something unrecognizable. But the lightsaber had always resisted such transformation, and it would not be broken so easily. The one who came to retrieve the weapon was Ben Skywalker, the son of Luke and Mara, the only child of their union. Still young, still raw with grief, Ben was walking his own perilous path, torn between vengeance and justice, struggling to find meaning after his mother's murder. And when Ben tracked down the weapon and the Dark Jedi who had stolen the saber, it was not a mission of politics or duty, it was personal. The confrontation was short and brutal. It was not a clash of lightsabers, but of ideologies. The Dark Jedi sought to preserve a symbol, but Ben sought to preserve his memory. Ben prevailed. He stood over the defeated enemy holding the weapon in his hand, not as a prize, but as something now deeper. A permanent tether to his mother, to his father, to his grandfather, to everything the galaxy expected him to be. I am Jedi Knight Ben Skywalker, son of Luke Skywalker, grandson of Anakin Skywalker, and this lightsaber is my birthright. In that moment, the saber returned to its line, not through inheritance, but through conviction. Ben had not been given the blade, he had reclaimed it. And when Ben ignited it, he did not ignite it in anger. He didn't seek its power. He didn't worship it. He respected the legacy. He made it what it was always meant to be, a Jedi weapon, a symbol of remembrance, and a legacy that was now reclaimed. But even the greatest weapons must rest. After the chaos of the Second Galactic Civil War, after the death of Mara, and after his son Ben reclaimed the lightsaber from its corruption, Luke made a decision that surprised many Jedi. Luke didn't use the lightsaber himself. He didn't pass it on to another. He didn't bury it with his wife. Luke retired it. In the quiet halls of the rebuilt Jedi Temple, Luke placed Anakin's saber not in an armory, but in a place of remembrance. Not as a tool to be drawn again in battle, but as a relic. An object meant to be honored, not wielded. For Luke, the lightsaber had come full circle. It was a symbol of hope and heritage given to him by Obi-Wan in the sands of Tatooine. It had been lost in despair on Bespin, turned into an experiment in madness of Mount Tantus, used as an instrument of justice and healing by Mara, reclaimed in grief and determination by Ben. But the blade's power was never in the lightsaber itself, it has always been what it represented. By retiring the weapon, Luke was not just setting it aside, he was preserving the legacy of Anakin. The weapon that had once helped destroy the Jedi was now a monument to their survival. Visitors of the temple would pass in silence, students would gaze upon it in awe, and somewhere deep in the Force, it always stood as a reminder. But with that, now we get to venture into the future. Nearly 100 years have passed. Over a century after Luke retired his father's lightsaber, the galaxy had changed beyond recognition. The Jedi Order had been rebuilt, scattered, and hunted once more. The Empire reborn under new rules. The Sith had returned in secret. But the Skywalker name always endured. Among the most powerful of this era stood Cole Skywalker, a descendant of Luke and a master of the Force. He was a warrior, a teacher, and one of the last defenders of Ossus, the Jedi's home. And the weapon that he carried was unmistakable. Cole Skywalker's lightsaber was built with a hilt nearly identical to that of Anakin's. The same grip, The same emitter, the same silhouette that cut through droids in the Clone Wars, clashed with Vader on Bespin, and was wielded by Mara Jade, was now claimed again in design by Cole. Once used to sack the Jedi Temple, it was now used to preserve, to protect it. And Cole Skywalker gave his life wielding a weapon that was meant to honor Anakin, protecting the Jedi from the Sith invaders. It was said that the weapon was reforged, given to Cade, Cole's son, the very last of the Skywalker line, and perhaps its most troubled heir. But even Cade could not ignore what the weapon represented. It was the blade of his father, of his legacy, of the entire Skywalker line, and Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber would forever be remembered. Its concrete whereabouts, however, are unknown, but it was never destroyed, and its importance never diminished. Upon his complete embrace of the dark side, Dooku would carry out missions for Sidious within the temple as a double agent. Most notably, he would venture into the archives and delete Kamino alongside other notable worlds from the archives. All of this was in an effort to cover up the Sith operation, and to keep the Jedi from finding Kamino before the time was perfect. But among these deletions, which numbered somewhere around 36 to 38 worlds in total and systems, these included Dagobah, Dromund Kaas, and recently, we talked about why Tyrannus erased the swamp world Dagobah from the databanks. But we were still very curious about the Sith world of Dromund Kaas. This was a planet of great significance to the Ancient Order, and it was also heavily feared by the Jedi. Many in the Jedi Order treated it as mythical, with younglings telling ghost stories about it to frighten their peers, and even Jedi Knights thought of it more as an old legend. But Dooku still saw fit to make sure that none of them were found. Many years in the future, Luke would end up learning more about Dromund Kaas, and he figured out why it was so feared by his predecessors. Luke would even follow in Dooku's footsteps, and suppress all mentions of the world so that it remained mythical. So what was it about this planet that made it such a terrifying world? Well, join us today, as we ourselves go in, and find out why both Dooku and Luke Skywalker deleted this Sith planet. When thinking of significant worlds of the ancient Sith, many immediately default to the worlds of Korriban or Ziost, but the importance of Dromund Kaas dates back to the very beginning of its empire. Long ago, around 27,700 BBY, Dromund Kaas was settled and established as one of the bastion worlds of the ancient Sith Empire. This was the era following the death of the Sith Ari, King Adis. It remained a place of great power for tens of thousands of years after, though the histories of what happened during this time have long since been lost. But it would be one of the planets rediscovered by Sor's Sin, when the original 12 Dark Jedi took over and began linking the sacred worlds of Sith space. As the years drenched on, Dromund Kaas became a sort of second burial planet for less notable or disgraced Sith Lords, and at some point prior to 5000 BBY, its location was completely lost altogether. But that exact year of 5000 BBY, during the Great Hyperspace War, Naga Sadow was off attacking the Republic and having the war turned against him. Another powerful Sith Lord that many of us know, Darth Vitiate though, had just performed the ritual of Nathema, draining both the planet and the 8,000 Sith Lords of their Force energies, making himself all-powerful and nearly immortal. Vitiate would return to Korriban, declaring that the Great Hyperspace War was lost, and if the Sith people wanted to survive, they would need to follow him, renaming himself as their Emperor. Vitiate would preach that they needed to venture into the unknown, as droves of Sith Lords followed him, and he took them all on an exodus through the unknown regions and wild space. It would be here where the Sith would grow to rely on him, revering him not simply as an emperor, but as their god. Soon enough, he would be the one to rediscover the planet of Dromund Kaas, and make it the Sith throne world of the reconstituted empire. For about 1300 years, the world would remain a place of immense power and importance. Kaas City was created amidst the bleak jungles. As a new Sith empire expanded, it would become the center of commerce and trade. It was the place where the Sith Emperor himself resided and lived, and so the Dark Council would meet in Kaas City's citadel in order to discuss business. As the war with the Republic kicked into a greater gear though, its political power expanded until Dromund Kaas was the hub world of the entire empire. But during this 1,000-year reign of the world, Darth Vitiate would find the wrathful spirits of the long-dead Sith Lords there were causing his workers and servants many issues. They were known to possess beings and to drive them to insanity, desperate for life and power. Vitiate refused to be challenged, especially by the dead. So he would construct what is known as the Dark Temple, a massive burial structure which emulated the tombs of Korriban. However, the temple was not a tomb of honor, but a place for the disgraced Sith Lords, for the spirits of the damned to remain inside for eternity, keeping them from flooding the planet and causing more issues. It was a grand prison. However, the place became more than a prison for the spirits, but also for Darth Vitiate himself, as he conducted more rituals and experiments within. He regularly went within the Dark Temple and harnessed the powers of the ghosts themselves to use their energies. This exponentially grew his already exceptional abilities and knowledge, as it focused the powers of the dark side until the planet itself became a nexus of evil. The rituals ended up altering the weather of the planet, cloaking it in an eternal thunderstorm. Many Sith were forbidden to enter this temple because of how dangerous it was, the spirits still lingering there, and if anyone got close, they were at risk of losing their mind and becoming slaves. It took the Jedi a very long time to locate Dromund Kaas during the Great Galactic War. For decades, its location remained as one of the Sith Empire's best kept secrets, but even when they did finally find it, they were largely unable to conquer it. The Sith fought with everything they had to keep the world under their control, and it remained that way for the entirety of the 3 wars that spanned the Old Republic period. Once the wars finally concluded, and the Sith were driven back into obscurity though, the Jedi did what they could to keep the world out of their reach. They did not allow tourists to the world, and allowed the name of Dromund Kaas to fade into legend. Even amongst members of their own order, they hid its location. Only a few Jedi actually knew that the ghost stories that they were telling were all true. And one of those Jedi would be Master Dooku. Dooku had always had a fascination with the things of the dark side. As a Padawan, he had stolen a Sith holocron from the forbidden section of the archives and learned many things. Into adulthood, he would study the histories of the Sith more and more, even more than most Jedi were allowed to. But he did so on his own time as to not arouse suspicion. But once he actually joined the Order of Dark Lords, Dooku became obsessed with Sith lore and devouring all that he could. This would be where he learned the truth about Dromund Kaas. Around this time, Palpatine had taken the mantle as Dark Lord of the Sith, and he had ventured to the Sith's ancestral worlds. He would discover Dromund Kaas again, and find that the prophets of the dark side were still living and active there. This religion was an offshoot of the Rule of Two made by one of its members hundreds of years ago. Sidious, finding this, decided to use the prophets for his own plans, and so after thousands of years, the machinations on Dromund Kaas began anew. To ensure that these worlds would never be discovered, he ordered Dooku to delete Dromund Kaas alongside Kamino from the Jedi archives, as well as ordering the purge of 38 other systems. But we don't believe it ends here. Dooku had more reasons to remove Dromund Kaas than his own master's orders. The planet was one of the few Sith treasured worlds that remained powerful in the dark side, unstopped by the Jedi. It had somehow recovered from when Vitiate had drained it of all energy during the Second Galactic War, likely due to the Dark Temple and the power of the spirits that lay within. And so, unlike Korriban, which was a husk of its former glory, Dromund Kaas retained its potency, making it valuable to all Sith and Darksiders, almost sacred. It was even recorded that Darth Sidious had successfully spoken with many Sith spirits there, but the power of Korriban had faded into mere echoes. It wasn't ideal for Sidious to establish any operations there. After all, when looking at a map of Sith space, Korriban is at the center of it. The Jedi would be able to find it quite easily, and so it served no real purpose for Sidious or Dooku. But Dromund Kaas, on the other hand, remained one of the most elusive worlds to the Jedi. It screamed loudly with the dark side still, and so to protect its sanctity and master his plans, Dooku deleted the world and covered it up with dozens of other erasures that he made, including Dagobah and Kamino. After the beginning of the Clone Wars, Yoda himself would go into the archives and attempt to learn all of the planets that had been erased by Dooku. This was where he found Dagobah again, and according to the Dark Forces saga, he would also find Dromund Kaas had been deleted. Allegedly, Yoda took a secret personal mission to the Sith planet to see what it was all about. However, what he did there is completely unknown, since those records were highly classified and only known to the High Council. But the result was that the planet was rediscovered. Dromund Kaas would even host a battle of the Clone Wars, as the 327th Star Corps would find out what Palpatine was working on when they ran into a separatist force led by Ventress. But every attempt to fight against the Separatists failed, because the prophets of the dark side were using precognition to inform the Separatists of the clone troopers' every move. And once the Empire was instituted, Sidious continued to keep the world a secret, and would train his dark side adepts there. It was only rediscovered during the days of Luke Skywalker's Jedi Academy, as the Dark Forces saga is a 6-part RPG scenario that tells the story of how Kyle Katarn would go missing. Kyle somehow found his way to the Dark Temple, where he was then possessed and corrupted by the dark side. Mara Jade would attempt to find him, and ended up uncovering Yoda's lightsaber and the history of the Jedi's terror surrounding the world, discovering its ancient, unrivaled evil. Mara Jade would eventually find herself inside of the temple, as she fought living statues and mummified corpses of long-dead Sith Lords, until she finally managed to find Kyle Katarn. After the two of them dueled, Mara was able to bring him back to the light before he ultimately would have struck her down, as they both fled the planet afterwards and would tell Luke everything. Absolutely shocked by this, Katarn, Luke, and other Jedi were able to piece together a few of the planet's histories, including its role for Palpatine and importance. But Luke was very nervous, especially after one of his most powerful Jedi in Kyle Katarn had been completely corrupted by the temple within. Luke stated that Dromund Kaas would need to wait until the Jedi Order became stronger. With the aid of New Republic intelligence, Luke was able to ensure that the planet remained a complete myth to the wider records, essentially re-deleting it from all of the archives. The Jedi would not return to the world until the days of Abeloth, but as always, it stayed a closely guarded secret of all of the Jedi Order, with many of them not knowing about it. Sound familiar? It also makes it incredibly unique. It was the planet that both Count Dooku and Luke Skywalker wanted to hide from the galaxy. Although their reasons were obviously different, Dromund Kaas was a planet that was far too dangerous for the Jedi to know about. Either way you slice it, in fact. Why they made their decisions to keep its location suppressed was for the greater good. I love exploring dangerous Sith worlds. They never fail to bring up frightening stories of paranormal activity, spooky secrets, and dark betrayals. Dromund Kaas is one of those planets that doesn't get talked about enough in the lore, as it's usually just seen as a meeting world for the Dark Council. But it held so much more power and significance than just that. It was the capital world for two Sith empires, and was perpetually elusive to the Jedi, and when they finally found it, they came to wish that they hadn't. One of the most shocking and tragic moments of Anakin Skywalker's betrayal was when he lashed out at his wife Padme on the landing port of Mustafar. Despite her being pregnant and ready to give birth at any moment, Anakin's rage fully consumed him, as he gave in to the pressures of the darkness. Whenever Obi-Wan arrived, Lord Vader had believed that the Jedi had fully turned his wife against him. He was enraged that the woman he trusted would bring his best friend to murder him. It was a heartbreaking moment, and the one that Luke Skywalker would be spared of for many, many years. Luke never truly knew the extent of his father's evil until he would watch it when he was much older. He had already known Vader when he was redeemed, and he could sense the darkness that had originated within him. But he also slowly unraveled the truths of the dark deeds whenever he became a Jedi Master. And one of the final depraved actions that Luke beheld was the moment where he watched Anakin kill his own mother inadvertently. Of all of the things that he had known his father was capable of, this would be the most troubling one to grapple with. So what was Luke Skywalker's reaction to seeing this horrific moment on Mustafar? Well, R2-D2 has been kind enough to give us a glance into this moment and the most secret files that we could find. But before we dive in, the droid also informed us of something else. Many who are trying to access the data have not yet subscribed to the archives yet. So if you're interested in discovering more about what Luke thought of the days before his birth, then reach out with the Force and crush that subscribe button so that you can be notified every time we take a deep dive. Now, Acolytes, let's begin. The secret files of R2-D2 were kept in his memory recordings of everything that he witnessed in the entirety of the prequel era. Since he had been there for practically everything, he stored it all away in his memory files. But fearful of having his memory wiped eventually, R2 would squirrel away the traumatizing events in a locked section of his memory bank, so that no one but the most important individuals could ever access it. Ever since knowing Luke, the little astromech had been hesitant to reveal much of what he knew. And to be fair, Luke never actually really asked him to. Luke didn't know that R2 had these memories, but in the latter days of the new Jedi Order, Luke had now fully stepped into his role as the Grand Master. And then, it was discovered that R2 kept recordings pertaining to Luke's mother and father that he had not seen. The droid had been reluctant to show Luke anything pertaining to them, especially the recording of Mustafar. In his own words, he was worried that it would overload Luke's circuits. However, Luke was compelled to look within R2's memory bank, because there was a rumor that arose that Mara Jade was the one who had murdered Padme, and Luke needed to know. By this point, the year was nearing 40 ABY, and R2 had kept these secret recordings buried so deeply that they required a slicer to install a new gate into his circuits that then could access all of the files. When R2 awoke after being updated, he was still reluctant to show Luke the recording, and even wanted to run away. but Luke ended up convincing him to show the raw, uncut footage. And so, with great hesitancy, R2 projected the scene from his memory core, starting at the moment when Anakin ran out to the landing pad to meet Padme. Luke, Mara Jade, and Jacen Solo were all present during this recording. Jacen was eager to see his grandfather and grandmother for the very first time, but even he wasn't ready to view what the tapes held. As the footage went on, the two of them began to talk. Padme told him that she had heard terrible things about what he had done, and Anakin simply denied it, insisting that Obi-Wan was attempting to turn her against him. Luke was on the edge, hearing the irrational, the dangerous edge of Anakin's voice, but he told R2 that he was fine, and he continued to watch. While he understood why R2 had kept these things from him, Jacen believed that pain was only dangerous when it was feared. This had been one of the lessons taught to him by Vergere. In Jacen's opinion, Luke needed to see the end of the Hollow and embrace that pain. Jacen at this point had already undergone his training with Vergere during the time when he was captured by the Yuuzhan Vong, and under her instructions, he was taught how to be effective, efficient, that pain was not to be feared, but confronted and then overcame. That was the only way to ensure things would stay done, or to finish them yourself. Needless to say, while he was far from the days of Darth Caedus, Jacen was already taking steps in that direction. As they continued watching though, Padme declared that all she wanted was Anakin's love, but the fallen chosen one declared that love would not save her, only his new power. Anakin said that he refused to lose her the way that he had lost his mother. As Luke watched on, he felt that Anakin's face now belonged to someone else, someone angry, frightened, and selfish. When Padme pleaded with him to come with her, to leave everything behind, Anakin simply responded that they don't have to run. He's more powerful than the Chancellor, that he can overthrow him, that they can rule the galaxy, make things the way that they want them to be. This is what the novel reads about Luke's reaction to all of this. Luke sighed audibly, clearly dismayed at the arrogance that had led his father down the dark path of an oppressor. But Jacen found himself responding to his grandfather far more sympathetically, almost with an admiration. Anakin Skywalker had understood his own strength, and at one point in time at least, he had tried to use that strength to bring about peace. Vergere would have approved of this. Power unused was power wasted, and whatever had happened to him later, Anakin Skywalker had at least attempted to use his for a good end. This is fascinating. Luke and Jacen are getting two entirely different impacts from this video of Anakin. While Jacen found himself admiring Anakin's reasoning and drive to make real change, Luke was exacerbated at his father's pride and his blindness. He would remember when Darth Vader had tried to recruit him on Cloud City, promising that they would rule the galaxy as father and son. It all made sense now. Vader had been just as blind then as he was on Mustafar. He didn't understand that people with real love didn't need or want that power. It was a concept that he couldn't understand until the very end of his life. It was a tragedy. But as you continue to watch, the scene grew drastic. Padme, now heartbroken, saw what had become of her husband. She didn't know him anymore. He was going down a path that she could not follow. Anakin was darker in appearance now, accusing Obi-Wan of having poisoned her mind. In one more desperate plea, Padme only asks him to return with her while he still could. But Skywalker knows it is too late. Somewhere off screen though, Obi-Wan had now entered. Anakin's mind was eclipsed with rage at the sight of the Jedi Master. The loving husband, the hero of the Jedi Order in the Clone War, was gone. The soon-to-be father was pushed back behind the mask of the tyrant Lord Vader. He shouted and accused that his wife had betrayed him, that she brought Obi-Wan there to murder him, and with that, he force-choked his own wife through the Force. This is what the book reads as Luke sees this happen. Luke cried out in disbelief, and the Force grew heavy with grief and outrage. Even Jacen, whose time among the Yuuzhan Vong had taught him to never be surprised by the brutality of one being and what they could inflict on another. Even Jacen felt his stomach turn at the sight of his grandfather using the Force to choke the woman he supposedly loved. Luke's very presence in the Force changes as he watches one of the darkest deeds of the Dark Lord Vader. As Anakin drops Padme out of frame and he begins to shout at Kenobi, the recording reaches an abrupt conclusion. This entire process of digging up such old data has shot some of R2-D2's circuits, and he was forced to stop the playback. But this was all enough for Luke. As the hologram dissolved into a static, everyone was silent. The book then reads this. Luke was stiff and ashen, fighting back tears. Mara was staring at the spot where Padme's limp form had vanished from the hollow. Jacen was trying to decide where his grandfather had gone wrong, trying to puzzle out what flaw had made him a slave to his temper. Even R2-D2 remained silent, continuing to project a column of hollow static onto the floor. Tears were escaping down Luke's cheeks now, and Jacen could sense him struggling with the anger he felt towards his father. It left a fiery, bitter taste in the Force, all the more powerful because of the forgiveness that Luke had already granted Anakin, but he was still angry. For the first time in a while, Luke feels so powerful in his emotion towards his father that it makes it worse, as this is after Luke finds out about Anakin murdering the younglings. R2 had hidden other data that he had shown him sometime prior. During that, Luke had struggled with his feelings, but was able to compartmentalize. In order to cope, he reminded himself that Anakin and Vader were two entirely separate people. In his mind, the actions of Vader could not and should not be counted as the sins of Anakin. But this time was different. He had watched in real time. He had seen one transform, shift into the other before his very eyes. Luke was so overcome with this that he refused to call Anakin by his name from that recording. He insisted that it had been Darth Vader that had harmed his mother. Only Vader. Immediately after viewing everything, Luke had to take a long moment to calm down before becoming irritable. R2 did have the recordings of when Padme breathed her final breath, but Luke denied watching it. He didn't need to. He knew that Mara did not kill her. Jacen, however, knew that he was running from the footage, because he knew that he didn't want to face the pain. Jacen wanted Luke to see that moment. He wanted Luke to confront this moment, to watch his mother die. He attempted to argue for Luke to watch it, believing that it was necessary for him to overcome the obstacle, to truly overcome the darkness. But Luke actually snaps at Jacen, telling him that he does not think he needs to see anything more. And from here, the conversation shifts to the crisis that they have at hand. Luke had not been able to know his parents, even though he did have a loving family on Tatooine. Although it was a rough journey, he got to know his father through Anakin's Force Ghost, as well as anecdotes by Obi-Wan, and scraps of information left behind in journals, old holo recordings. But as for Padme, Luke knew next to nothing. He had seen some images of her before this recording, but this is one of the only times he ever saw footage of her. And of course, it happened to be the worst moment of her entire life, when Vader came out and committed an act that would lead to Padme losing the will to even live. Despite having many decades of experience at this point, and being a near master of his emotions, Luke felt such anguish and distress that it changed the entire air of the Force around him. But with this, we also find Jacen's reaction fascinating, and the clear steps towards his eventual transformation into Darth Caedus are becoming more and more clear. As many of you are aware, Leia never actually saw this recording, and it's a good thing she didn't. It took a much longer time for Leia to forgive Anakin for his actions as Vader. We only ever get to see snippets of how Luke finds out about the events of the Clone Wars though, and the deep past associated with his parents and the Jedi. But each and every time it's compelling and exciting, especially hearing his thoughts after the fact, when he has some time to study the ways of the Jedi and become more familiar with the Force. His reactions with confronting what Anakin really was is fascinating. But anyway, if you want us to find more moments like this one, reporting them back to you, then be sure to let us know. And if you're curious on the source for today's video, this story comes to us in the final entry in the Dark Nest trilogy, in the book called Swarm War, just in case you want to read it yourself. Luke Skywalker is the figurehead of the Jedi in the modern imagination. To many, he represents everything a Jedi should be: compassionate, selfless, devoted to the light. But buried under that popular image is a truth that most never consider: Luke's approach to lightsaber combat, his lightsaber philosophy. Luke's philosophy had a dangerous departure from the previous order. Unlike the masters of the previous Republic in Yoda, Windu, and Ki-Adi-Mundi, Luke did not train in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant from infancy. He did not spend decades steeped in doctrine, practicing the graceful defensive forms that the Jedi of the Clone Wars relied upon. Instead, Luke Skywalker learned the art of the blade in the crucible of a real war, against enemies who showed no mercy. Above all, it was his father, Darth Vader, who served as Luke's ultimate instructor, shaping him into a swordsman who believed in ending conflicts swiftly, decisively, and if necessary, lethally. To To understand Luke Skywalker as a Jedi is to understand that his lightsaber style was not merely an imitation of the past. This was actually a conscious rejection of some of the most treasured dogmas of the old Jedi Order, and a testament to the lessons that he learned from the most dangerous foe that he would ever face, a Sith Lord, Lord Vader. This is why Luke Skywalker fought the way that he did, and why the Council of the Last Jedi Order would have looked upon him with both awe, but ultimately fear and dread. Why they considered Luke Skywalker's lightsaber form to be extreme. The traditional Jedi philosophy, a culture of restraint. For thousands of years, the Jedi Order taught that the blade was a last resort. Their combat doctrine was built more on patience, negotiation, and defense. Even when forced to draw their lightsabers, most Jedi defaulted to Form 3 Sarisu, a style that prized survival over victory. Yoda the Grandmaster had long maintained that a Jedi must never allow aggression to dictate their actions. The Jedi Code enshrined this ideal in its very language. There is no emotion, there is peace. There is no passion, there is serenity. These were not hollow slogans. They were the foundation of a culture that believed violence was inherently corrupting. To act in anger, even in self-defense, was to risk falling to the dark side. Jedi Masters like Obi-Wan and Yoda taught that every duel must be approached with measured detachment. Even the thought of killing an opponent was to be suppressed whenever possible. In many ways, the Jedi's restraint was admirable, but in their long struggle against the Sith and the dark side, it became a massive glaring weakness. The Clone Wars exposed this fatal flaw in stark relief. The Sith did not fight to subdue, they fought to annihilate. Dooku was once a Jedi Master himself. He was a practitioner of Form 2 Makashi, the dueling style perfected for one-on-one combat. Anakin Skywalker meanwhile had embraced Gemso, a form designed to dominate through overwhelming strength and aggression. Many on the Council originally disapproved of Anakin's aggressive style. They believed it even bordered on arrogance, but Anakin believed, not without reason, that a Jedi needed the power to end a battle before the darkness could spread. Peace through superior arms. After Anakin fell to the dark side though, this tension between restraint and decisiveness would resurface in another Jedi, in his son, Luke. Unlike the younglings who began their training as toddlers, Luke started with nothing. He was a farm boy from Tatooine with no formal instruction until he met Obi-Wan Kenobi, and even then, Obi-Wan had only a few days to teach Luke the most basic concepts of lightsaber combat. He learned to deflect blaster bolts with a training remote aboard the Falcon. He received cryptic wisdom about the Force, but he never experienced the rigorous years-long institution that shaped Jedi like Mace Windu or Plo Koon. When Obi-Wan sacrificed himself, Luke lost his first mentor, and from here, he would only have a handful of days with Yoda on Dagobah. While Yoda imparted profound insights about the Force and the dangers of fear, he offered almost no direct instruction in lightsaber combat. This meant Luke's practical education came on the battlefield. His first real duel against Vader on Cloud City was a brutal, humiliating lesson. Vader dominated him without even using his full strength, dissecting his technique and battering him into submission. Yet in that defeat, Luke learned more than any Jedi instructor had ever taught him. Vader demonstrated the consequences of every error, how a careless swing could be punished with an immediate reprisal, how overextension created openings, how a single moment of hesitation could cost you everything. Luke emerged from Bespin scarred in body and in spirit, but with a new understanding of what mastery of the lightsaber required. Luke knew that his life and the fate of the galaxy would depend on his ability to fight like a warrior, not fight like a student. Not to fight like the old Jedi had. When Luke returned to face Vader on the second Death Star, he was no longer a novice. He was calm, focused, and determined to redeem his father. But even then, Vader remained the most dangerous opponent he had encountered. Vader's style was a fusion of multiple forms, each adapted to the realities of his own ruined body and his life-supporting armor. He was a broken, wounded, extremely dangerous monster. He had once heavily relied on Form 5 Gemso as Anakin, the raw, overwhelming power that had allowed him to batter down enemies with sheer force. But after Mustafar, everything would change. Encased in armor that both sustained and imprisoned him, Vader lost much of his speed and all of his athleticism that defined his previous approach to duels. He could no longer rely purely on aggression or strength. Instead, Vader was forced to evolve, become something more methodical, more precise. To compensate, Vader began to incorporate significant elements of other forms. Form 3 Sarisu, the same as his old master Obi-Wan, the same form that he had perfected. Ironically, Obi-Wan's defensive techniques had defeated Vader on Mustafar when Anakin's reckless aggression left him exposed. This was a humiliating lesson that Vader would never forget. He came to understand perhaps more profoundly than any other Jedi or Sith of this era that an enemy can teach you more than any master ever will. Cerisu's principles of patient defense and careful redirection became essential to Vader's survival. He learned to absorb and deflect attacks efficiently. He learned to conserve his energy instead of relying on explosive maneuvers. In many ways, Obi-Wan remained Vader's most enduring teacher. Proof that even the humblest defensive style can bring down the most fearsome offense. But Vader would not stop here. He also wove in elements of Form 2 Makashi. Count Dooku, once Darth Tyrannus, had been Anakin's other great rival. Dooku's Form 2 was elegant, economical, and utterly precise, beautiful. Everything Anakin's Form 5 was not. After Mustafar, Vader studied Makashi with renewed appreciation. And in the confines of his armor, where brute force could no longer compensate for lost speed, Vader learned the value of refined technique. Vader trained to control the tempo of a duel, to place every strike exactly where it would do the most harm, and to conserve motion whenever possible. The result was a style that blended Cerisu's impenetrable defense with Makashi's clinical efficiency, overlaid atop the residual power of Form 5. Ironically, this adaptation made Vader an even more lethal swordsman than Anakin had ever been. Where Anakin had relied on talent and raw physicality, Vader now relied on mastery. He could no longer afford mistakes, and so he made fewer of them. When Luke faced Vader in their duel, he wasn't merely facing the corrupted shadow of Anakin. He was facing a warrior who had integrated the lessons of Obi-Wan and Dooku, two of the greatest duelists in all of galactic history, and who had fused their styles into something singular, relentless, and terrifying. This would shape the philosophy of Luke Skywalker and the rest of the Jedi Order from that point forward once Luke would become Grandmaster. The crucible of Darth Vader. Emerging from the Galactic Civil War, Luke carried a new conviction. He believed a Jedi could not afford to let evil linger. Every duel was a crisis that had to be resolved as quickly as possible, because the longer the darkness was allowed to fester, the stronger it would become. This belief shaped his combat philosophy entirely. While Luke had inherited Form 5 from his father, he adapted it to suit his own temperament. Luke's style blended Gemso's powerful counters with a deliberate, almost surgical focus. Unlike many Jedi who treated their lightsabers as primarily a defensive tool, Luke saw this as an opportunity to impose finality. If a dark side user could be turned, he would try. But if they were determined to sow destruction, he would not hesitate to end the fight decisively. In this way, Luke's technique represented a quiet rebellion against the old Jedi way. He learned firsthand that restraint, while noble, could be fatal. The Jedi of the Republic believed patience alone would prevail, but Luke understood that sometimes it simply brought the dark side more power and more time to grow. This philosophy is why in Legends, Luke trained his new Jedi Order differently. He did not insist on a single doctrine of defense. Instead, Luke emphasized adaptability, decisiveness, and a clear understanding that mercy and inaction are not the same thing. Luke knew that in the galaxy's darkest hours, the greatest threat to peace was not aggression itself, but the refusal to act when action was necessary. This was a lesson the old Jedi had struggled to internalize. They believed that if they simply held fast to their doctrine, if they trusted in the slow unfolding of the Force's will, evil would always be contained. But Luke saw how that very mindset allowed Palpatine to rise unchecked, how it blinded the Jedi to the darkness growing in this mindset. To many of the High Council, the idea that a Jedi should strike preemptively or commit fully to offensive tactics would be seen as heresy. They would have argued that Luke's philosophy was a gateway to the same corruption that consumed Anakin. But in truth, Luke's approach was not born of arrogance or fear, it was born of understanding. He had faced the shadow in his own heart, and learned that suppressing it did not make it disappear. Only confronting it directly could bring clarity and peace. This was why Luke never taught his students to fear their instincts. Instead, he taught them to know themselves so completely that no sudden surge of emotion would sway them. Luke trained them to meet conflict with resolve, not with hesitation. And while he would have respected Yoda's caution, he also knew that caution alone could never be enough to safeguard the galaxy from the dark side or the Sith. In rebuilding the Jedi, Luke rejected the idea that emotion must be shunned. He believed that compassion, connection, and even righteous anger could be harnessed for good. His new Jedi Order was a place where students would encourage to explore every facet of themselves, to question old dogmas, and to learn from the past without being shackled to it. This philosophy extended to lightsaber combat. Luke taught Form 5 as the backbone of their discipline, but he insisted that every apprentice also learn the subtleties of Form 3, the precision of Form 2. They studied Cerisu's calm defense and Makashi's elegant economy of movement. But Luke evolved the lightsaber forms. He no longer called them forms 1 through 7. Instead, like his father, he hybridized them. And so the Jedi learned this way. But Luke's Jedi in lightsaber combat were far more aggressive than the previous order. Unlike the Jedi of the previous Republic until the Clone Wars broke out, Luke and his Jedi had seen war. They had seen conflict. They had seen death. They had seen the dark side. Luke had learned how Palpatine and Dooku had picked apart the Jedi who had used less efficient forms during the Clone Wars, how their pragmatism and defensive styles only delayed the inevitable. Luke knew firsthand how an opponent's strength could become lessons. His father's hybridized style had shown him that surviving long enough to end the threat often required adaptability above anything. This was why he believed his students needed to be more than just warriors. They had to be students of the entire tradition. Luke's academy became a place of synthesis, where no single doctrine was sacred. Every form was a tool, every philosophy a perspective to be examined. While some in the New Republic viewed this as dangerous, an opening for the darkness to creep back into the Jedi Order, Luke saw it as the only way to ensure that his order would never again be blinded by arrogance or complacency. This is reflected perfectly in his lightsaber skill. Everything Luke taught his students can be traced back to the final duel on the second Death Star. In that moment, every lesson, every failure, and every hope converged. He began the duel resolved not to fight. Luke knew that if he struck down his father in anger, he risked everything. But when Vader threatened Leia, Luke's love for his sister ignited a ferocity that he could no longer contain. His attack was reckless. It was purposeful. Each strike was delivered with the full force of his conviction to protect. It gave him real power. And when he severed Vader's hand, he saw the wires of the scorched metal, and he understood what he was becoming. Luke recognized that to truly defeat the darkness, he had to defeat it within himself. So he laid down his weapon. In that moment, Luke achieved what no Jedi before him had managed: perfect synthesis. He had fought with all of his strength, acted with all of his resolve, and then chosen compassion. This was not being passive. It was the ultimate act of will. Luke's order carried this philosophy deep into the future. His apprentices became a generation who embraced adaptability, compassion, and a readiness to act. They were taught that when darkness arises, it must be confronted swiftly, not delayed in the hope that it will resolve itself. But they also learned that no matter how powerful a Jedi becomes, the most important choice is the one to lay down their blade when victory is already won. That to strike in anger is to betray everything they stand for. Luke's lightsaber style was the embodiment of this duality. It combined Form 5's raw power, Form 3's impenetrable defenses, and Form 2's elegance, just like Vader. But most importantly, it was wielded by a man who had known both the temptation of hate and the triumph of compassion. His legacy is a testament to the idea that a Jedi's purpose is not simply to preserve peace, but to create it through courage, empathy, and the willingness to confront darkness without becoming it. In the end, Luke Skywalker was a Jedi who surpassed the limitations of the Old Order. He was the heir to their wisdom, but he also carried the hard lessons of their failure. He understood that peace does not come from inaction, but from the willingness to act decisively when the moment demands it, and the strength to stop when enough has been done. This is why the old Jedi would have feared him, because in Luke, they would have seen a vision of what they may become if they would be willing to question their own dogma. A Jedi who understood that sometimes the greatest threat to peace is not the darkness outside, but the fear of wielding the light within. Darth Vader was clearly the most impactful foe that Luke Skywalker would ever face, but he certainly was not the most powerful. Many would agree while citing enemies such as Dark Empire Sidious or Abeloth, but there's actually one Sith Lord that Luke faced who was declared to have surpassed Vader in terms of power and threat level. The Sith in question is none other than Luke's own nephew, Jacen Solo, or perhaps for the purposes of this holocron, Darth Caedus. It feels hard to believe that any Sith besides Sidious could lay claim to being stronger than Vader, but the proof does exist, and we're here to discuss it. Welcome back, lore junkies, to the archives we've been waiting for you, and in today's video, we're going to be jetting forward in the timeline into the post-Return of the Jedi EU era, wherein we find yet another Skywalker has fallen to the dark side, and now casts a bleak shadow across the galaxy. Our aim is to examine Darth Caedus to find out exactly why he was considered more dangerous than Vader, and if that claim actually holds water. Needless to say, spoilers lay ahead for the majority of the EU novels. To begin, we need to make something clear.
The notion that Qui-Gon is stronger than Vader doesn't come from an in-universe quote exactly, but rather it comes from a publisher summary on the back of Legacy of the Force, Invincible. It says here, "For Qui-Gon is a scion of both the Skywalker and the Solo bloodlines whose command of the Force surpasses even that of his grandfather Darth Vader. But that claim does not strike us as erroneous, especially once we actually view the powers and feats of Qui-Gon while doing some quick and dirty power math." Before embracing the dark side, Jacen was already a premier Jedi with a connection to the Force that hadn't been seen since Luke. All Skywalker and Solo children inherited the same potential from Anakin that Luke had, but there was just something different about Jacen, and we know it boils down to his training, his open-mindedness to all the facets of the Force, and its many different views and interpretations. At the climax of the Yuzhong Vong War, Jacen Solo achieves a state of oneness in the Force. This is a state where his identity became fully one with the will of the Force, granting him insane temporary power while causing his body to glow with a golden light. The experience lasted only for a few brief moments, but while he was one of the only beings to actually accomplish this in the physical form, other beings like Luke Skywalker and Galen Marek have as well. While in this state, Jacen felt as if he had broken past the concepts of light and dark and understood the true nature of the Force. However, when Jacen returned to normal, he perceived that it was not possible for him to ever achieve oneness again. He was charged by the experience, however, and he went out into the galaxy to search for all kinds of perspectives on the Force from beings other than Jedi. The scars of the war and this experience leaving a heavy burden on the young Jedi. He trained with the Barrandov sages, learning their mastery of electricity with the Hassat Dur technique. This allowed Jacen to control the electromagnetic waves within his own body, enabling him to appear brain-dead on monitors and even produce a different type of Force lightning. Training with the Ang-Ti monks also allowed Jacen to use the fold space technique. This enabled a form of Force teleportation of sorts, and the power of flow walking. Flow walking was the way of sending one's presence through the Force into the past or the future to observe events taking place. Beyond this, Jacen also learned how to employ extremely convincing Force illusions that were strong enough to fool even Mara Jade and Luke's son Ben. Jacen then used that moment of hesitation to end Mara's life, and upon becoming a Dark Lord of the Sith in full, the potency of all of Jacen's powers were multiplied. He was able to invade others' minds with ease, dominating even those that had strong wills, and he would even murder Boba Fett's daughter, Aelin Vel, by crushing her mind. Qui-Gon's arsenal of strange Force powers allowed the Dark Lord to advance his training beyond anything seen by Jedi for thousands of years. But now let us look at Vader, an absolute powerhouse of raw strength and mortal terror, able to rip ships out of the air and to tear down AT-ATs on command. And of course, he had no equal in saber combat during his era, besides maybe Yoda, Darth Sidious, or others. But Darth Qui-Gon sets himself aside, combining his greatest power with a much larger pool of techniques. What many do not realize is that Darth Vader really didn't study the Force once he became a Dark Lord. Sidious attempted to give him texts and holocrons, but Vader rarely looked over them, and when he did, he paid attention to the wrong things. When Sidious had Vader look over the journal of Darth Malgus, he was hoping that his apprentice would glean some inspiration on how to lead as a Dark Lord. But what Vader cared about was the ships and the droids used in this ancient era, while also wanting to learn more about Malgus' secret lover. This Dark Lord was much less interested in the secrets of the dark side. Rather than learn more about the Force, Vader took what he already knew and honed it beyond perfection. This made his Force chokes and telekinesis devastating, his lightsaber technique sharper than any warrior in existence, but he was limited by a narrow focus. Darth Qui-Gon, on the other hand, embraced his full potential, and he cast a wide net into his studies. He drew powers and abilities from as many places as he could, not exactly for the purpose of gaining more power, but for gaining something more precious: understanding. A domino effect occurred where his knowledge and the esoteric aspects of the Force reinforced his prior knowledge of all of the basics, making Darth Qui-Gon exponentially stronger and better at other techniques. The biggest reason he is seen as being more dangerous than Vader is because Qui-Gon fulfilled the study of the Force that Darth Vader clearly neglected. Now, some might say that having access to a lot of Force abilities is well and good, but Vader's raw potency makes up for that lack of knowledge. And to this we have to look at Qui-Gon's feats, his accomplishments in the era in which he lives. Qui-Gon became a Dark Lord of the Sith in 40 ABY, which is around the time that Grandmaster Luke Skywalker was reaching the absolute apex of his own galaxy-quaking power. There was an occasion where Luke overpowered Qui-Gon with the Force and even made the Dark Lord feel truly afraid. But But Qui-Gon had been caught off guard in this moment, and the two later had a duel wherein they were both extremely well prepared. When the duel occurred, they actually had each other on the ropes, and by the point of both of them becoming one-man armies, Luke having taken down dozens of soldiers personally during the Vong War, Luke was thought to be undefeatable at the lightsaber by this point. But Qui-Gon managed to land several hits on Luke with his weapon, injuring the Grandmaster quite a bit, and giving him a real challenge. Thankfully, later we get Darth Qui-Gon's own personal reflection on this exact duel, and although he considered it to have been a loss, he was still prideful of the fight that he put up against his uncle. Qui-Gon acknowledged the very thing that we're acknowledging now, that he made Luke Skywalker sweat and actually put in a considerable amount of real effort. This is Grandmaster Luke, who by now had far surpassed even Prime Darth Sidious. The Prime we speak of is his clone incarnation in the Dark Empire series. Here, where all of Sidious's titanic power and the experience of his old body was injected into a younger clone who wielded the dark side with wild abandon. Luke managed to defeat that Sidious and win that day, but the event had occurred about 30 years prior to where we find Luke and Qui-Gon now. By now, the Grandmaster has dwarfed Sidious's power, and once again it's worth mentioning that Vader was always cut to 80% of the Emperor's potential, and Qui-Gon was challenging this version of Grandmaster Luke. For further proof, after this very fight with Luke, Qui-Gon would face down 4 of Luke's Jedi, one of which was none other than Battlemaster Kyle Katarn. At this point, Qui-Gon had sustained some heavy injuries, including a lightsaber blow that nearly punctured his kidney, and so despite being wounded and exhausted, he could still perceive in the Force that the 3 Jedi were no match for his skill. Qui-Gon ragdolled them with the Force, and fended them off with ease. He only perceived Katarn as a threat, but he still handily defeated him by crashing a speeder into Kyle with the Force, and then stabbing him. It's worth noting that this was also an experienced, full-blown Battlemaster Kyle Katarn. When Kyle was younger, he had fought and defeated Inquisitor Jarek, and by this point in time that the duel had occurred, Jarek was stated to be comparable to Darth Vader in terms of raw power, although I believe this to be slightly embellished. But a final example to drive the point home, we need only look at Luke's approach to Qui-Gon in comparison to his approach to Vader. He had felt both of their powers personally, and was able to accurately compare them. The new Sith Lord's youth, his embrace of his potential, and his expansive abilities in the Force, as well as a willingness to use any means necessary to win the day, caused Luke to believe that he was a greater threat than Darth Vader. Luke was confident that he would be able to appeal to Vader's inner light, but when it came to Jacen, Luke actually refused to engage him in a duel ever again. Even if he would be able to win, he knew that his own feelings could potentially draw him to the dark side. Qui-Gon had killed his wife Mara, and Luke did not trust himself to fight him on a personal level, and so he had tasked Jacen's twin sister Jaina with taking care of the Sith issue. And by taking care, we mean eliminate. But here's the kicker. Luke had always known that Vader could be redeemed after everything he had done, and despite that knowledge and hope that still existed from the past, Luke did not believe that Jacen could be saved. By the late stages of Qui-Gon's Sithhood, Luke made it clear to Jaina that her role was not to turn him or redeem him, but to destroy him. She was even given the title, the Sword of the Jedi, for this very task. This is such a diametrically opposed stance to the one that Luke would take with Vader. Even when he fell to the dark side himself, he had to be brought back by his sister Leia, and despite knowing the redemptive power of love, and how it can save one who has fallen, Luke did not believe that Qui-Gon could be redeemed, because what Qui-Gon was doing in his mind was the right thing. Qui-Gon even viewed himself as a sacrificial lamb. Jacen was not tricked the way that Anakin and Luke had been. He went to the dark side with full knowledge and intention to become a villain in a twisted effort to save the galaxy from a vision that he had experienced. Jacen was ready to become the thing that he had hated for a good purpose, but that purpose became warped, made into something truly vile. But Qui-Gon was neither sorry nor remorseful. He continued to make excuses and justifications until the boy that was Jacen Solo was no more. And although Luke was deeply conflicted, it was the decision that he ultimately came to that Qui-Gon needed to die. One might argue that Vader's atrocities were worse, but Qui-Gon managed to outdo his grandfather at almost every turn. Qui-Gon became so evil and ruthless that he was beyond even redemption in the eyes of the Jedi. And that, my friends, is our reasoning to why Darth Qui-Gon was stronger and more dangerous than Lord Vader. A lot of the time it can be difficult to admit that someone like Vader has been outdone by anyone, especially because he is typically seen as the pinnacle of the Sith.
The Sith have always thought of the Jedi as a pitiful lot, wielding a weaker half of the Force. With their steadfast belief that passion trumps peace, their fire usually carries them into manifesting more destructive abilities, those that easily kill. But the one person that the Sith consistently respect, whether begrudgingly or not, is the Grand Master. These beings are the leaders of the Jedi Order for a reason, as they wield immense power in the light by virtue of their wisdom and experience. Most Sith are forced to respect them, or at least acknowledge them, most of the time, purely based on their strength alone. But there is one thing that we have discovered that the Sith seem to fear above anything else. That is the possibility of a Grand Master turning to the dark side. It's a hypothetical situation that seems impossible, but according to two Sith Lords who saw what would happen if Yoda or Luke embraced the darkness, it would be the worst thing that could ever happen to the galaxy. Perhaps it would even mean the galaxy's end. The end of both the Jedi and the Sith. Greetings again, Acolytes, and welcome back to the Archives. In today's Holocron, we are going to analyze the instances where Dooku and Qui-Gon both peeked into an alternate reality where their respective Grand Masters became dark. And in both scenarios, the two Dark Lords of the Sith were mortified at the implications of such power. But before we dive in, we too have had visions with mortifying implications. Many who are watching today have not yet subscribed, so if you desire to share in our knowledge of Legends lore and the expanded works, be sure to force crush that subscribe button. It is your destiny. We have foreseen it. Now, let us open the Holocron. The Sith enjoy making a habit of persuading Jedi to embrace the dark side. They get a sick sort of pleasure by feeling that the light within a person should die out, and the penumbra of the dark side begins to overtake it. They will corrupt any well of the light, whether that be a Jedi or a light side nexus. In canon, the Sith take it a step further with the bleeding process of kyber crystals. Corruption of the light is nothing new for a Sith Lord. In fact, many used to be Jedi themselves, intimately familiar with what it's like to snuff out the light and to embrace the dark side. However, of all of the Jedi the Sith try to tempt, the leader of their order is never among them. This is usually for a very good reason. Many times, the Sith know that the Jedi Grandmaster is far too rooted in the light, and any attempt to sway them to the dark is a waste of time and energy. But there is another reason, a reason that Dooku would learn the hard way. The scene has now become famous among scholars of the Legends library, and it comes from Yoda Dark Rendezvous. In the book, Yoda has a talk with Dooku in his castle on Vajun. The Grandmaster has traveled across the entire galaxy and snuck through all of the Sith Lord's defenses just so that he could have a chat with his old apprentice. Yoda even has a simple question. What turned Dooku to the dark side? Dooku was completely caught off guard by this request, but Yoda was determined. He wanted to know why the dark side was so enticing, why it had turned so many good Jedi away from that path, including his old friend. So he asked Dooku to his face, attempting to convince him to join the dark side so that he could understand what really has tempted so many of his students. Yoda is asking sincerely. He wants to know what is so appealing to the dark side. He genuinely does not understand. But he also has a point to prove. The two enter a verbal sparring match, where Dooku insists that the dark side could give Yoda anything he ever wanted. Yoda then says that he simply wants a rose. The tiny humble request to make a rose appear enrages Dooku. Obviously, the Force doesn't conjure things from thin air, and Dooku tells Yoda to be serious, to want something else. However, Yoda continues to parry the thwart of each one of these arguments, because to the humble Grand Master, he doesn't desire anything else. Yoda brings up that he already has great amounts of abilities in the Force. He has no need for wealth either. He has lived in a palace bigger than Dooku's, referencing the temple on Coruscant. He has also commanded great armies. There was nothing that Dooku had in the dark side that Yoda felt he needed. This infuriates Darth Tyrannus. He becomes frustrated by Yoda's continual lack of selfish desire. And then we get to this passage from the book. "I want to be safe," Dooku says in frustration. "Want to be free from fear." "I will never be safe," Yoda said. He turned away from Dooku, a shapeless bundle under a battered, acid-eaten cloak. The universe is large and cold and very dark. That is the truth. What I love taken from me will be, late or soon. And no power is there, dark or light, that can save me. Murdered, Jai Murak was when looking after him I had, and Makus Leem, and all the many, many Jedi that I have lost. My family they were. "So be angry about that," Dooku exclaims. "Hate, rage, despair. Allow yourself just once to stop playing at the game of a Jedi Knight. To admit what you have always known. You are alone, and you are great. And when the world strikes you, it is better to strike back than to turn your cheek. Feel, Yoda. I can feel the darkness rising in you. Here, in this place, be honest for once and feel the truth of yourself. At this moment, Yoda turned, and Dooku gasped. Whether it was the play of the holo monitors beaming their views of bleak space and distant battles, or some other trick of the light, Yoda's face was deeply hidden in the shadows, mottled black and blue, so that for one terrible instant, he looked exactly like Darth Sidious. Or rather, it was Yoda as he might have been, or yet could still become. A Yoda gone rotten. A Yoda whose awesome powers have been utterly unleashed by his connection to the dark side. In a flash, Dooku saw how foolish he had been, trying to urge the old master to the dark side. If Yoda ever turned that way, Sidious himself would be annihilated. The universe has yet to comprehend the kind of evil that a Jedi Knight of nearly 900 years could wield. From the shadows, Yoda spoke. Disappointment, like I not, Apprentice, he snarled in a wicked, wicked voice. Give me my rose. This left Dooku literally trembling with fear. But after Yoda relented, he left the shadows and suppressed the dark. He says that in a rather conversational way, that the dark side is just not for him. That simple taste had been enough for Dooku to realize just how dangerous a Sith Yoda truly was. And this would not be the last time that someone feared the power of a Dark Grandmaster. The next time, many, many years in the future, Jacen Solo goes down a path of darkness due to a vision that he once experienced. He saw something known as the Throne of Balance within the realm of the Force. Upon it sat a dark, armored figure, surrounded by many acolytes, wielders of the dark side. He ruled over the galaxy with an iron fist that was seemingly unstoppable in its reach and power. There was only one man with that kind of power that Jacen knew. Grandmaster Luke Skywalker. He was the only one where the vision would make sense. This vision terrified Jacen so much that he decided that the only way to make sure that this did not happen was to control the Sith himself. He later saw a vision of his own daughter upon the throne instead of this dark warrior, and so he worked ceaselessly to ensure that this would happen, instead of Luke becoming the Dark Man. But what Qui-Gon did not know is that the Dark Man was a different Sith, Darth Krayt, or at the time Asherad Het. Asherad, who was concurrently building the Sith Order, the one Sith on Korriban. But since the knowledge was not known to Jacen, he could only perceive that the kind of power that this being wielded was his uncle Luke. His fear would only double when he would eventually feel the real power that Luke had always been hiding, always operating below his strength, as to not needlessly murder people, obliterate them with his raw strength. There would be a day when Qui-Gon went too far, prompting a final confrontation between himself and Luke aboard his own capital ship, which would lead to this interaction. In the next instant, Qui-Gon found himself flying across the cabin towards his observation bubble. Luke had not gestured, he had not flinched, he had not even shifted his gaze. He had simply grabbed Qui-Gon in the Force and hurled him 5 meters into his chair. Qui-Gon sprung from the chair, or attempted to. Instead though, he found himself struggling against an invisible weight. He felt as if he were accelerating to light speed with a faulty internal compensator. Luke, you've gone mad. Qui-Gon reached for the controls of the arm of his chair and discovered that he couldn't do that much. You can't do this. I know you're having trouble dealing with Mara's death, but this has nothing to do with Mara, Luke said, and you're lucky it doesn't. If she were here, if she had known what you were using Ben for, there would be pieces of you scattered along the entire length of your ship. The irony of the statement was far from lost on Qui-Gon, but he was too astonished, too frightened to take any pleasure in it. While it was true that Luke had taken him by surprise, it was equally true that he had done so with no visible effort, and that he was continuing to hold him with no apparent exertion. Keenly aware that all that stood between him and a quick sudden death was Luke Skywalker's much strained sense of decency. Qui-Gon let a little of his very real fear seep into the Force, just enough to seem properly alarmed. While Luke did not open himself up to the dark side in the instance like Yoda did, he did allow his raw strength to be shown as he totally overpowered Qui-Gon. The restraint that he showed was not crushing him with the Force, which he very well could have done. Both Qui-Gon and Dooku feared for their lives in the face of a Grandmaster who took off the kid gloves. The possibility of their power eventually becoming dark was enough to make some of the most powerful Sith Lords that have ever existed quiver in fear, to cower before the Grandmasters. Upon analyzing these two instances, we at the Archives came to a conclusion about the state of mind that the Sith have towards this event. They are absolutely terrified of a Dark Lord who knows the light side intimately. As much as the Sith like to boast that the light is weaker, they secretly fear many of its more esoteric applications. For a Jedi Grandmaster who has spent their entire lives becoming powerful in the light, they could translate all of that knowledge to the dark side instantaneously. Thus, they would gain a giant breadth of knowledge in the Force, becoming the ultimate juggernaut. Dooku says that Yoda's power would totally overshadow Sidious's to the point of completely annihilating him. If Yoda were to ever become a Sith Lord, he would become greater than all of the Rule of Two. Dooku fears the idea of a galaxy that doesn't have himself or Sidious in it. For him, a Dark Yoda represents total oblivion. It is like staring into the void of chaos. It was much the same for Qui-Gon, who believed that Luke, had he been the Dark Man, then the galaxy would be at his mercy forever. Literally no one could stop him. What's so fascinating about this phenomenon is the sheer depth of fear that the Sith have for Dark Grandmasters. They don't really treat it as though a Dark Grandmaster would be a huge threat, or a rival. They instantly, genuinely believe that if they were to embrace the Dark, that it would literally be over. There is no fighting them. There is no resisting. The one option they have is the same option that the rest of the galaxy is using, which is leaving a Jedi Grandmaster exactly where they belong, in the light. By leaving well enough alone, they are avoiding one mistake that could be apocalyptic to both Jedi and Sith alike. Eventually, Luke also found out about Qui-Gon's vision and was deeply disturbed by the implications of it. He didn't think that he had fallen to the dark side, but he trusted visions granted by the Force. Luke and Ben would then go on a journey together to figure out why Jacen had fallen to the dark side, retracing his steps. On one occasion, Ben was worried about his father suddenly becoming dark, learning the abilities that Jacen had learned. His own son says this: "What if you're Luke Skywalker one morning, and then wake up Darth Starkiller the next?" We enjoy this callback to what Luke Skywalker's name was originally going to be in the first draft of A New Hope, but it is an interesting prospect to consider that Darth Starkiller would be an apt name for Luke. It would reveal the power that he had at his command, and as at this point in time he had performed insane feats in the light side well beyond the powers of Grandmaster Yoda, he has wrestled control of a black hole without much strain or effort, and his emerald lightning could kill on contact. Despite all of these amazing feats, Jaina Solo once insisted that she didn't think that she had actually witnessed a fourth of Luke's true power. If he were to become Darth Starkiller, he would start by being comparable to the likes of Emperor Valkorion, and have not found many instances where a Grandmaster actually falls to the dark side. We've all had moments where we've come close, but thankfully, none of the Grandmasters ever have crossed that line. Then again, they wouldn't be worthy of the title if they had. A Grandmaster is the wisest, the strongest of the Jedi. Their experience in the light side of the Force is what allowed them to rise through the ranks, to get voted as the leader of the Jedi in the first place. Only beings of exceptional wisdom, resolve, and a foundation in the Jedi way can achieve the rank of a Grandmaster. The likelihood that they give themselves over to the dark side is close to none, almost impossible. But that doesn't mean that a chance doesn't exist somewhere else out there. And as we've explored, should that ever happen, it would mean complete annihilation. Darth Qui-Gon, a Sith Lord who Luke said was more powerful than Darth Vader, was instantly blown away by the implications of a dark side Luke. Same could be said for Dooku and Yoda. It is not a question of if they could conquer the galaxy with their immense power, but rather what would be left afterwards. What would be left after the desolation? In the days of the post-Empire Jedi Order, the new Jedi had to be creative. There was very little knowledge available about what a Jedi should be outside of their core tenets. This gave rise to some of the most unorthodox types of Jedi ever seen in Star Wars lore, who all find their own path in the realms of combat. In that pursuit, today we wanted to analyze a particularly deadly Jedi with one of the most unconventional fighting styles ever seen. And that person would be Mara Jade Skywalker. Mara Jade is very prominent within the extended universe chronology. She began her journey as Luke's assassin, and then eventually became his wife. But it was her unique variety of training that made her such a special Jedi in Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Praxium. She was formerly one of the Emperor's hands, trained directly by Darth Sidious himself. And later, she would complete her training under Luke and Kyle Katarn, resulting in a strange but an effective combat form that sets her apart from almost any other Force wielder. Although Luke's Jedi were strapped for information, luckily we are not. The Legends timeline may have concluded years ago, but it continues to yield its secrets, which we aim to bring you with every upload. If you enjoy this video and want to learn more about the esoteric corners of a galaxy far, far away, then be sure to reach out and crush that subscribe button. Then you too can become a lore junkie and get your daily fix of Star Wars Legends knowledge. Now, my friends, let's begin. Mara Jade's story and her training began on Coruscant, when she was given directly to the Emperor by her parents at a very young age. Mara Jade grew up within the Imperial Palace, and as soon as she could walk and talk, she was already being given training in the Force as a deadly weapon. The Emperor had her training alongside his royal guards. The guards were some of the most deadly fighters in the galaxy in this era. Their intense combat training made them comparable to Jedi Knights, despite many of them not being Force sensitive. By the age of 14, Mara was specialized in covert espionage, spying, as well as assassination. As a test by the Emperor, she once attended an Imperial party disguised as a guest, and then slipped away into Grand Moff Tarkin's personal quarters, retrieving classified files from his safe. In the process, she managed to quietly dispatch a few guard droids with her slicing skills. This event impressed Palpatine enough to appoint her directly as the Emperor's hand, which made her his personal agent. Unbeknownst to Mara Jade though, there were many Emperor's hands, but each of them thought that they were the only one. This was by design, so that they would believe that they were special to the Emperor, and would do everything they could to please him. But of all of the hands, Mara Jade was his favorite, simply because of how exceptional she was at her job. Because of this, Palpatine spoiled her, and lavished her with gifts to make her more loving and ultimately dependent on him. And then he did something even more rare. He would personally give her training in the dark side, but her utilization of it was a bit more low-key. Mara Jade was never taught deep Sith secrets, but was able to harness the Force within her body to carry it beyond natural limits. And soon enough, she constructed her own amethyst-bladed lightsaber, and was taught the art of lightsaber combat. Considering the fact that her primary job was as a spy though, she rarely entered a battle with her lightsaber unless it was absolutely necessary. Mara's main weapons were information gathering, sabotage, and the occasional blaster. She would work to root out rebel cells, and even kill Imperial officials when Palpatine demanded it. Mara carried out Palpatine's will on numerous worlds, eliminating corrupt Imperial officers, traitors, and others who he deemed deserving of death or judgment. In one of Mara Jade's many missions, she managed to prove a Moff guilty of treason. He had been skimming off the top of the collected taxes, and had stolen several priceless pieces of art that belonged to the Empire. Upon bringing her findings to the Emperor, the Moff was executed on her word alone. Mara Jade was so effective in stealth that Palpatine would even have her spy on Lord Vader, and report on his apprentice's dealings. Of all of the Emperor's hands, Darth Vader despised Mara Jade the most, and it wasn't even close. She truly believed that she was something special, and even though Vader knew that she wasn't, he wasn't allowed to show her. She often acted smugly towards Vader, and tried to undermine him in every turn in front of Palpatine. The Emperor found their rivalry amusing, and allowed it to continue on simply for his own entertainment. Palpatine knew that Mara Jade had no chance of replacing Vader, but allowed her to act arrogantly towards him so that it would incentivize Vader to outperform her. To rub salt in this wound, Palpatine even allowed Mara Jade to be present when the Emperor disciplined Lord Vader. There was even a time when he took one of Darth Vader's cybernetic arms following the destruction of the Death Star, and Mara Jade saw it. But Mara Jade's information gathering skills would eventually prove useful to even Vader when she tracked down one of the most elusive Jedi survivors, the Dark Woman, Anya Kuro. Although Jade insisted on killing the Dark Woman herself, Vader accurately pointed out that she stood no chance against such a powerful Jedi. Palpatine ultimately ruled that Vader should go since he had far more experience, but he also wanted to ensure that Mara Jade stayed alive. He had much more important missions for her. When she was spying on Vader, she came to learn that he was obsessed with finding a boy and a rebel by the name of Luke Skywalker. She had already been tasked with finding the rebels responsible for the Death Star's destruction, which led her directly to Luke. But what she could not figure out was not only Vader's obsession with him, but the strange conflict that she sensed within the Dark Lord. Palpatine was also wary about Vader's obsession with Luke, and did not want him to become a fully fledged Jedi. He sent Mara Jade to kill Luke, which led to her disguising herself as one of Jabba's dancers at the time when Luke and the gang infiltrated Jabba's palace. However, her mission went awry when Luke's execution was turned on its head. Mara barely managed to escape the sail barge before it was destroyed, causing her to fail one of her first missions. This was something that basically never happened, and she now had a personal vendetta against Luke because of this. As she worked her way back to the Emperor, she continued to ponder the weird connection between Luke and Vader. Secretly, she had hoped that Vader would turn against the Emperor so that she could kill him and take his place as his true apprentice. But she was unfortunately not present when the ultimate betrayal occurred. When her master perished on the second Death Star, she could do nothing to stop it. However, due to her deep connection with him in the Force, she could hear Palpatine's voice anywhere in the galaxy through a telepathic link. His last message to her was to stop at nothing to avenge him and to kill Luke Skywalker. But both the message and the feeling of the Emperor's death in the Force was just too much for her, and she ended up closing herself up to the Force from the pain. This decision was magnified after her loss to Lady Lumiya on Endor, which cost her her first lightsaber. For many years, she would work with a smuggler lord by the name of Talon, but during the Thrawn crisis, she would find herself in the crossfire between Thrawn and the New Republic, which put Luke back in her crosshairs as well. With a renewed desire for vengeance, she once again attempted to kill the Jedi. However, with Thrawn threatening the smugglers and her new way of life, she hesitantly teamed up with Luke in order to stop the Chiss. Over the course of their tense alliance, she gained a begrudging respect for the Jedi, especially once the two worked together to put down the mad dark Jedi Joruus C'baoth. As the years went on, Mara continued to work with Talon, and the smugglers and the Jedi would even work together. With prodding from Luke, Mara Jade would eventually join his academy to complete her training in the Force and to regain her abilities. Mara Jade was a rare student, as she was on and off again, sometimes training under Luke and later receiving formal training from Kyle Katarn. But eventually, a romance budded between the two of them, and they were forced to admit their feelings for one another. Luke and Mara Jade would get married, and she would officially join the new Jedi Order, later becoming a member of the Jedi High Council. By then, Mara Jade had become an excellent fighter with a vast array of skills and abilities. She was the ultimate Swiss Army knife, with skills in tech slicing, mechanics, piloting, espionage, and of course, a master of disguise. Upon reading an old Jedi text, Luke would later comment that if he were to bring back the old classifications of Guardian, Consular, and Sentinel, Mara Jade would excel as a Jedi Sentinel. Ironically, the class of Jedi that Palpatine feared the most. They did the same sorts of things, combining knowledge in the Force with practical civilian skills. But when she actually entered the ring with an opponent, they were in store for a shocking display of physical proficiency and one of the most unique fighters in all of the lore. Her style was this, combining her athletics, martial arts, street fighting, Force abilities, and lightsaber combat to become a literal living weapon. This was aided by her specialized danger sense and enhanced reaction time. Luke would later come to believe that her danger sense was more keen than even his own as Grandmaster. Luke would regularly rely on her intuition in most situations, and although she had to relearn how to manifest the Force, one thing that she never had to relearn was her ability to harness the Force within her physical body. With her intuition and physicality working in tandem, Mara Jade's reaction time was so sharp that she dodged Force lightning on multiple occasions. When facing Joruus C'baoth, she had reawoken her Force abilities and was able to weave and deflect his lightning with her lightsaber. She rushed him down without even being hindered by it. In a different occasion, a dark Jedi shot Force lightning at her at point-blank range. With her eyes closed, she managed to backbend to narrowly avoid it, and dropped into a scissor kick to sweep her opponent off of their feet. Her pure athleticism put her beyond what most Jedi could achieve. Towards the end of her life as a Jedi, she would eventually fight Jacen Solo, now Darth Caedus. It should be known that Darth Caedus is one of the most powerful Sith Lords to ever live, even one of the most powerful Force wielders to ever live even, whose strength and power in the Force by Luke is said to have exceeded Darth Vader. He had been hunted down by Mara Jade and the two crash-landed in a cave. Caedus sustained some injuries, but he was able to fight efficiently. But despite his mastery in the Force, which by this point eclipsed Mara Jade's, Mara was still able to keep pace with him. She was so quick that even his titanic power in the Force was not able to get him away from her, and he was stressed in their duel. Her physicality extended to her damage resistance as well. Multiple times Jacen would fling her against the cave wall, but each time she got back up and doggedly came at him without ever giving him a break. Eventually, he had to rely on trickery, using illusions to actually defeat her. Darth Qui-Gon was afraid of the power of Mara Jade. In another duel with Lumiya, Mara Jade would use Force Valor to the point where she overpowered Lumiya despite her being a cyborg with armor modeled after Lord Vader's. Mara sprang horizontally from a crouch and cannoned into Lumiya's legs with all of the power that she could muster from the Force. She hit solid durasteel. Blood flooded her mouth, but she couldn't feel a thing. Not yet. Clinging to Lumiya's knees with one arm, denying her the space to swing the whip, she brought her down like a felled tree before smashing her head into the woman's face. It should be known that Lumiya's faceplate was also armored, and this action cut Mara's forehead. But despite the pain, she pushed through and continued to grapple with the Dark Lady. In a final impressive display at her pain tolerance, at one point Mara Jade would use Force Lightning for the first time, and even though her body erupted into pain and muscle tremors, she powered through it to unleash Force Lightning and to blast her enemy away. Interestingly, even as a Jedi Master, Mara continued to carry around a blaster pistol, and would sometimes use it in tandem with her lightsaber. She did this throughout the Yuzhong Vong War to surprise enemies and to catch them off guard, and even used this same style against Lumiya. Because Mara grew up as an assassin first, the idea of honorability in Jedi combat was a foreign concept to her. Mara Jade functioned in the way that she got the job done. She was not above trickery and fighting dirty either. Confident in her hand-to-hand combat, she would sometimes deactivate her lightsaber to prompt her enemies to charge at her and to close the gap. She would then disarm them and beat them down with her martial prowess, and if the situation called for it, reactivate her lightsaber and execute them dishonorably. She was known to use the Force in very subtle ways in combat, using the Force to even trip her enemies. When facing Lumiya the second time, Mara would use telekinesis to slow Lumiya's whip long enough for her to leap out of the way, and rather than use Force pushes to hurl people back, the pushes were more compact and acted like a telekinetic punch. Whenever she ripped off a Force push, it would break stone, crush bones, and drive the breath out of her enemies. But by and large, Mara Jade would focus her Force powers internally, aiding her shockingly ruthless art of fighting. She would use Terminus and had deflected blaster bolts and shots using Force abilities. Her mastery over her body made it so not even Jacen Solo could influence it. In their duel, he attempted to shock her spine in order to paralyze her, but she detected the attempt and parried it aside with the Force. She was not above using the rare abilities such as Morchiro either, to slow down her breathing and vitals if it helped preserve her life in survival situations, or even if it allowed her to remain hidden. All in all, Mara Jade Skywalker was an absolute beast, and the Clone Wars era Jedi would have hated the way that she fought. She is absolutely one of the strangest Jedi in terms of how they fight and what lightsaber techniques they use. Interestingly though, she trained with both Sith and Jedi, but it was her life as a smuggler that would inform her in a fighting style the most. Mara Jade's approach to the Force and to the lightsaber is very unique. Rather than acknowledging the spiritual aspect of a Jedi's life, she perceived these gifts the same way that a burglar would view tools in a lock-picking set. Each ability or weapon has its function for a variety of purposes, and none of them are mutually exclusive to Jedi, Sith, Light, or Dark. She uses whatever serves her best in the situation that it calls for, and doesn't worry about whether it falls in line with any sort of creed or any sort of code. When there's an opponent in front of her, she uses all of her talents combined to take them down. She was as elegant as a dancer, but as scrappy as a cantina brawler, and she always mixed it up with methods that she used to keep her enemies off guard. If backed into a corner, Mara Jade would forgo her own personal safety to see the mission complete, to the point of ignoring shocking amounts of pain and life-threatening injury. Mara Jade did not fight like a Jedi. She didn't even think like one. Where most Jedi sought harmony through the Force, Mara Jade sought something different. Her instincts were sharpened by years as an assassin, her will refined by Palpatine and Skywalker. She was a creation of contradiction, a product of light and dark, forged by the Emperor's ruthlessness and Luke's compassion. It is not an understatement to say that Mara Jade Skywalker was one of the most brutal and tactical Jedi fighters to ever exist. She abandoned the traditional sense of honor in combat, wielding deception and strategy as weapons of survival. She was living proof that Luke Skywalker's new Jedi Order was unlike any that had ever come before. It accepted those that had walked through fire, who carried both the scars and wisdom of past lives. Under the old Jedi Code, someone like Mara Jade could never have been trusted. but under Luke's order, she became one of the most respected Jedi Masters. What made her especially dangerous was that she didn't fight with the restraint expected from a Jedi Master. When she drew her lightsaber, she held nothing back. To Sith like Darth Qui-Gon and Lumiya, this was disorienting, even terrifying. They were used to Jedi who hesitated, who measured every strike, who sought balance between power and mercy. But Mara sought victory. She didn't temper her blows or her tactics. When she pushed herself, she unleashed everything she had. Her sensitivity, her assassin's cunning, her speed and precision with no hesitation. For opponents accustomed to Luke Skywalker's calm restraint, this was shock. Qui-Gon in particular underestimated her. He expected a Jedi duel defined by control, but instead, he faced an assassin. Every movement from Mara was sharp, efficient, and lethal. The culmination of Imperial training and Jedi mastery. There was no wasted motion, no mercy, only intent. When Mara Jade stopped holding back, she became something neither Jedi or Sith had prepared for. An embodiment of a gray in-between. That is what makes her dangerous. Not just her power, but her willingness to use all of it. A perfect example of a Jedi wielding an amethyst blade. Mara Jade Skywalker is a paradox, a Jedi forged by light and dark. She's proof that the Force doesn't belong to one side, but to those strong enough to wield it with purpose. She represents the perfect evolution of the Jedi under Luke Skywalker, strength born of imperfection, and that is why she is so feared and so unforgettable. So the question today I want to leave you with is this: was Mara Jade the beginning of a stronger type of Jedi, or the first sign that the Jedi would eventually lose their way yet again? Let me know your thoughts down below. Thank you for joining me in the archives here today, my friend, and may the Force be with you.